The scene opens in the midst of a battle where a group of warriors was fighting against a giant dragon. A girl calls the dragon Genelissar, declaring that he should prepare himself as she will put an end to his attack on the Howard Empire. Genelissar scoffs at the warriors, referring to them as mere insects. He taunts them, saying they never tire of crawling out of their holes and that half of an empire was far too little compensation for his dead child. He vows to tear them limb from limb and crush the other half of the empire. This intense battle was unfolding in a webtoon that the protagonist was watching while lying in a hospital bed. His mind, however, was elsewhere, on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It was a cruel illness that causes motor neurons to gradually die, leading to muscle paralysis throughout the body and ultimately death. He was diagnosed at the age of 25, a death sentence. At such a young age, with no family to turn to, the money he had saved and the future his youthful body once promised, all of it was destroyed by a single disease. 4 years had passed since his diagnosis. Now, at 29, he was left with nothing but a frail skeletal body and a fading will to live. Suddenly, his heartbeat began fluctuating wildly. The monitor's beeping grew erratic. As the doctors noticed the alarming change, they rushed toward him. The bird thought it had reached the end, certain that it would die. But after some time, it woke up to find a man standing before him. The man casually lifted an acute dragon, which turned out to be the boy in his new life. The boy was shocked to see that he had transformed into a dragon. At first, he thought he was going to faint, and in denial, he struggled to process what had happened. But as reality sank in, he accepted his new form and realized that he had been reincarnated as a dragon. He remembered that in all the novels and webtoons he had read, there was never a weak dragon. How could he possibly complain about being reincarnated as the strongest being in the world? And most importantly, dragons had the longest lifespans, around 10,000 years. He reflected on his past life, where he had to work from a young age, fell ill, and died in his prime years. But this life was different. He had been reincarnated as a dragon, and he was filled with excitement. With such a powerful new form, he felt ready to overcome any obstacle in his path. The man, noticing his excitement, addressed him as Louis and asked why he was so eager. He then suggested they go eat something. The man placed a cloth on Louis and served him some strange food. When Louis hesitated, the man assured him that it was the best when fresh, so he should just eat it. Louis thought he would never get used to this new life, but he reminded himself that when in Rome, one must follow Roman law. Similarly, as a dragon, he had to abide by the dragon laws. He ate the strange food, which surprisingly tasted like strawberries and was quite good. Curious, he tried some more, his eyes sparkling with excitement. The man, noticing his delight, asked if he liked it, encouraging him to eat more. Louis, feeling overwhelmed by the man's kindness, commented that his eyes were so expressive. He then called the man father, though he quickly added that he didn't want any more food. The word father seemed to catch the man off guard, and he asked Louis what was wrong, suggesting he should just call him dad. Louis, still processing the situation, realized that he was a dragon, and he didn't even know the man's name. So he asked. The man revealed his name, Genelissar. Louis froze, shocked. Genelissar was also the name of the giant dragon in the webtoon he had read before his death. As Louis sat there in shock, Genelissar stood up and asked what was wrong. Louis, frightened, quickly got up and left, muttering that it couldn't be true. He wandered to the library, still trying to convince himself that it was all a mistake. There he picked up a book and began reading. He found information about the Howard Empire, the very same empire from the amateur webtoon he used to read before he died. It hit him then. He hadn't been reincarnated as a dragon. Instead, he realized he had been possessed by the webtoon, and his story was now unfolding within it. Jean looked at Louis, asking if he was hurt. Louis thought about how gentle and caring Jean seemed as a father. He wondered if Jean, the mighty Genelissar, could truly be the same man he had read about in the webtoon. In that webtoon, Jean had been portrayed as a destructive force, vowing that he could never live peacefully again because of the arrogance of humanity. He promised to flood the entire continent with blood. Louis thought that Jean must have gone insane after his hatchling was killed by a human. Curious, Louis asked Jean if he had any older siblings. Jean replied that Louis was his only child. Louis then asked if Jean was planning to have more children. Jean, with a serious expression, told Louis that he had promised his wife they would have only one child and would raise him well. Louis was shocked. He realized that there had been no other siblings before him, and there wouldn't be any more. This meant that the hatchling who had died was not just any child. It was him. In the webtoon, Jean lost his children and went insane, wreaking havoc on the Empire. Louis was now in shock, realizing the weight of the situation. Jean, sensing Louis's distress, wondered what was wrong with him. Louis thought to himself that he was nothing more than a trigger for the story, the villain's child who had vanished before the plot even truly began. He had been reincarnated as a dragon, but not just any dragon, one fated to die. In the treasure room, Louis lay atop a mountain of gold coins, feeling exhausted. He reflected on how, much like in his previous life, he was still terminally ill, unable to enjoy any of his wealth, destined to die with it all being in vain. However, he refused to give in to despair. He told himself that he couldn't die like that. He went to his room to find a book to read, thinking that the year Jean went berserk was a crucial point he needed to remember. If he could pinpoint the year Jean lost control, he would be able to figure out when his own death was scheduled. That year would be 3589 AC. Given that the current year was 3090 AC, this meant that his death would occur between the ages of 498 and 499, 1 year before he reached adulthood. He was supposed to die as a child, but there was no way he was going to let that happen. He vowed to survive for the next 499 years, no matter what. As he drank something his father had prepared, he thought about another ball. It tasted so good. Jean filled his bowl with a smile, urging him to eat as much as he wanted. Just as Louis was about to take a bite, a bug landed on his food. Jean, noticing just in time, shouted Louis's name and quickly swatted the spoon from his hand. Louis asked that what it was. Jean relaxed and replied that he almost got himself into trouble. He showed Louis the bug, explaining that it was an artificial creature his father had been researching. While it posed no threat to dragons like them, it could be dangerous to a child as it was highly poisonous. Louis was shocked to hear this. Jean reassured him not to worry as he hadn't eaten it. Louis realized how close he had come to danger and reminded himself to start paying more attention. He left the room, walking past numerous guard statues lining the walls. Suddenly, one of the statues activated and charged at him. Before it could strike, Jean appeared just in time, stopping the guard and blasting it away. He then asked Louis if he was okay, puzzled that the guard was still able to attack, as he was certain he had set it up to avoid harming Louis. Louis was in shock, realizing that he had almost died twice in such a short span of time, yet his father had always been there to save him. A few days passed, and Louis no longer had any suspicions, instead becoming more convinced of Jean's intentions. One day, Jean took Louis outside, and Louis was thrilled to see the world beyond. In front of him stood a massive mountain. Jean explained that it was the left fang of Earth, one of two enormous mountains at the edge of the continent. It was famous for being home to many mysterious races. Louis, filled with excitement, guessed that it was even taller than Mount Everest and was certainly unlike anything he had ever read about in books. Louis then noticed a butterfly and began playing with it. Suddenly, the weather changed, dark clouds gathered, and a bolt of lightning struck Louis. Jean rushed toward him, but 2 more lightning strikes hit him in quick succession. He wondered if the script was trying to kill him. Jean grabbed Louis, crying, and quickly took him inside. Louis lay trembling in bed, reflecting on how he had nearly died. 3 lightning strikes had hit the exact same spot. What were the chances of that happening in such a short span of time? It felt as though fate was determined to end his life. But why so soon? He still had 498 years to live, and he was supposed to die at the hands of humans. But that he wondered, was this because he was determined not to die? He slammed his fist against the bed, wondering if the original story would only truly begin when he died. But how had the baby dragon in the webtoon survived for 500 years? He encouraged himself, thinking it wasn't the time to dwell on that. He needed to do something to change his fate. He needed something to protect him from this danger. Determined, he rushed to call Jean. Jean placed his hand on Louis's head and asked that what's going on. Louis asked if there was any equipment at home that could protect him. Jean nodded, explaining that they did have such equipment, but it was too early for Louis to use it. To wield it, Louis would need something called attribute power, which required a lot of training. Since Louis was still so young, he wouldn't be able to learn it for at least another 100 years. Louis stubbornly denied this, insisting he wanted to learn it right away. Jean was taken aback by his determination. Jean hesitated before saying that Louis was still young. Louis, acting cute, asked if he couldn't just learn it because he was little. Jean replied that he would learn once he had passed the stage of infancy. As Louis continued to act even cuter, Jean agreed to teach him. Louis then asked if he could teach him something difficult and heavy. Jean responded that before they began, there was a place they needed to visit first. For a child of the dragon race to discover his own attribute for the first time, he must seek the elders. Louis was confused and, seeing Jean outside the house, rushed to call him. Jean asked if he was all right. Louis asked how they would get to the elders' place. Jean replied that to get there, they would need to fly. He then shifted into his dragon form, and Louis was excited to see it. Jean offered his hand to help Louis climb on. As Louis sat on Jean's back, he was instructed to hold on tight. They then flew away at great speed. Louis found it difficult to hold on as they soared higher, wondering just how high they were going. Jean laughed and told him they still had a long way to go. As they flew above the sky, Louis looked around, wondering if they were about to soar through the atmosphere and into space. Jean reassured him that they were very close now. It was then that Louis saw something gleaming in the distance, and he grew even more excited. Jean asked if he was surprised. "That's the sacred land of our people, the dragon," Jean said. It's called the Silver Flowers Castle. As they landed, Jean mentioned that it had seemed even higher when they were close. He then took his human form and told Lewis, "Let's go inside." As they entered, a few of the dragons were sitting in their places. Sandra, the leader of the 13 Dragon Elders, wondered at their arrival. Jean greeted the group by introducing himself as the son of Pamis. Lewis also greeted them with a cheerful hello. Bartis, one of the 13 Elders, wondered if Lewis was Jean's child. He remarked that Lewis seemed very smart and diligent for the grandson of Pamis. Pamis, sitting next to him, grew annoyed. Jean turned to his father, Pamis, and said it had been a while since they last met. Pamis agreed, noting that it had been 623 years and the last time Jean visited was to introduce his wife, Valentia. Then Pamis scolded Jean, saying that he should have shown Lewis to him as soon as he was born and questioned why he was meeting him for the first time, along with all the others. Jean replied that Lewis had only been born a month ago, and Pamis demanded to know why Jean hadn't brought him sooner. Pamis then looked at Lewis, who called him Grandpa. The sweetness of Lewis's words melted Pamis's heart, and he beamed with happiness. He agreed with Lewis, saying that Lewis was indeed a fine-looking child to be his grandson. Another elder remarked that Pamis really adored his first grandchild. The second elder added that Pamis had been waiting for a grandchild for so long, so they should let him enjoy this moment. Sandra wondered if Jean had brought Lewis to discover his second attribute, but she felt it was too early. Jean replied that he thought the same, but Lewis had expressed a strong desire to learn. Pamis laughed, saying that Lewis had learned well, just like his grandpa. Sandra told him to be quiet for a moment. Still, Pamis smiled and Sandra sighed, knowing that Pamis would never stop. She then asked Lewis to step into the center. Lewis looked at his father with concern. Jean reassured him, telling him not to worry, as it wasn't anything serious. He simply needed to stand there. Lewis complied, standing in the center, and after a brief moment, Sandra instructed to let's begin. All the elders summoned their power spheres, and Lewis was amazed to see this spectacle unfolding before him. Sandra asked him to close his eyes and to focus as though his lifelong companion had just arrived. As Lewis followed her instructions, Jean observed closely and realized that Lewis's attribute was abstract time. He thought to himself that time attributes were usually stronger than natural ones, and he felt proud that his son was a genius. Pamis was equally surprised, then laughed, recognizing the strength attribute in Lewis. He realized it was a true reflection of his own lineage. Furthermore, Lewis had a dual attribute. Bartis commented that it had been a long time since a dragon in their kind was born with dual attributes. Sandra, however, was taken aback when she discovered that Lewis also possessed the space attribute. That meant he had a total of 3 attributes. She was stunned, for the first dragon king, Cadus, and the evil dragon, Ravrir, who had been swallowed by darkness, were the only 2 dragons in their long history known to possess triple attributes. It seemed that Lewis was on the verge of making history himself. As another elder asked to examine him, they discovered that Lewis also possessed the mental attribute. The 4 attributes materialized into spherical forms, and excitedly, Lewis grabbed them all. However, when he looked at the elders, he noticed they were staring at him, which made him feel scared. He nervously asked that why they all were looking at him like that. Jean, too, was shocked by the attributes Lewis had manifested. Jean and Lewis returned home. Sitting in his room, Lewis reflected on the 4 abstract attributes he possessed: time, space, strength, and mental, as well as a talent so immense that even dragons were left speechless. His potential was vast, so overwhelming that it could disrupt the balance of the original plot. With such abilities, he could possibly handle all the events in the story on his own. Perhaps the flow of the narrative had already been altered because of him, and those who sought his demise might be frustrated by their failure. However, what was the use of having the greatest talent if there was a chance he might die before even reaching maturity? But then Lewis found hope. While his talent had drawn danger upon him, it also presented an opportunity. If he honed his abilities well, his chances of survival would increase. Most importantly, he was not the same Lewis from the original story. He carried the memories of his past life, granting him awareness of the impending crisis ahead. Determined, he resolved to make the most of the 2 books in his possession. One contained magical skills that manipulated attributes, while the other taught martial arts that integrated attributes with the body. Now the question remained, which should he master first for the sake of survival? Lewis set aside the dilemma and decided to learn both magic and martial arts simultaneously. Meanwhile, the dragon's dead body, blessed with abundant mana and all 4 attributes, held great potential. With just a little more refinement, it would soon be possible to begin. Just then, his father entered the room with food, mentioning that Lewis had waited long enough and should eat now. Seeing the meal, Lewis couldn't help but drool. As the saying goes, even a journey to Mount Kumgang begins with a single meal, so he decided to eat first. Although the potions contained energy potent enough to make an ordinary being explode if consumed carelessly, dragons possess a special organ called the dragon heart. This organ allowed them to convert natural mana into their own attributes, making such a feast possible. Louis needed to eat well and grow strong quickly. As he ate, his father noticed how exhausted he looked. That night, as Louis slept clutching his rabbit toy, dark magic suddenly appeared, causing a fork to mysteriously fall to the ground and something strange to take shape. The next morning, Louis woke up confused. He wonders that when did he fall asleep? He vaguely remembered eating snacks before dozing off. His father called out, telling him to get up and have breakfast. As Louis climbed out of bed, he slipped, falling face first in front of the fork that had mysteriously appeared the night before. Louis wondered what was happening. He had nearly died from the fork that had been stuck in the floor, and it had been so long since he'd encountered such a clear death flag. He wondered where the coherence of his situation had gone. He then noticed Toto, his rabbit, had fallen some distance away and its thread was unraveling. He picked it up and said to himself that he would ask his father to fix it, as Toto was the only one he could vent to. While Louis ate his meal, Jean was busy stitching Toto back together, commenting that Louis must have been sad when Toto broke, but he reassured Louis that there was no need to worry. Jean would fix it. Suddenly, Louis snapped back to reality confused. He wondered how he had ended up here. Jean called out, urging him to come and eat. Louis looked at Toto, wondering when it had been fixed. He approached Jean with Toto in hand and mentioned that something felt off. Jean grew worried and asked if Louis had been hurt. Louis replied that he didn't feel any pain, but his memory was fuzzy, and he kept feeling sleepy. Jean smiled gently and explained that this wasn't pain. It was simply the approaching sleeping phase. Louis was puzzled and asked how long will he slept. Jean replied that there was no exact timeline, but roughly it will be around 100 years. Louis was shocked, and just a few days ago, he had that absurd death flag, and now he had to sleep for 100 years, and it was like they were asking me to die. He rushed off, muttering that this couldn't continue. He headed to his room to grab the book, thinking he needed to come up with a plan to stay awake as much as possible. His first strategy was to avoid eating, since a full stomach made dragons sleepy. Secondly, he would skip showers as they relaxed him. Thirdly, he would minimize physical movement to avoid exhaustion. And fourth, he had to stay far away from his bed. Just seeing it made him want to lie down. With this plan in mind, Louis decided to stay awake for as long as he could. However, after reading for a while, exhaustion set in. As he walked, Jean appeared with food, insisting that Louis needed nourishment. Louis didn't want to eat, but Jean was persistent, forcing him to take at least one spoonful. Louis then left for the library, muttering to himself that it had been a close call. He had nearly fallen asleep while eating. He started reading again, determined not to let his guard down until he found a way to resist sleep. As he read, his eyes grew heavy, and despite his efforts to stay awake, they kept closing. He tried as hard as he could, but eventually he fell asleep. After some time, Louis woke up on the couch with Jean standing nearby. Jean asked if he had slept well. Louis replied that he hadn't exactly slept, but had just dozed off for a bit. Jean smiled and congratulated him. Louis, puzzled, wondered what his father was congratulating him for. Jean then mentioned that they would be celebrating Louis's 100th birthday, which left Louis in shock. 100 years later, Jean brought snacks to Louis in the library, only to find that he was sleeping. Jean thought to himself that Louis must have fallen asleep while reading that adorable book. Jean gently moved Louis to his bed, muttering that if only he had eaten more before sleeping, this wouldn't have happened. But since Louis was already asleep, Jean hoped he would wake up safely. Jean placed a hand on Louis's head, whispering good night and he will see Louis next day. He then returned to his work in the library. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from Louis's room. Rushing to check, he found Louis still asleep in bed, while a shelf had fallen nearby, though not directly on him. Jean asked if he was hurt at all. Louis remained asleep. Jean stood up, noting that there was no sign of a breach in the room. The legs of the shelf, made from noble parrot and wood, had simply broken for no apparent reason. Jean couldn't help but think back to the decades that followed, during which countless mysterious incidents occurred. It was as though someone was trying to kill Louis. Over and over again, Louis had come close to dying. Jean didn't know why these things kept happening to his son. So as a precaution, he had implemented safeguards in every way he could. Despite everything, it didn't matter to him. His own lifespan was insignificant as long as he could keep Louis safe. For the past 60 years, Jean hadn't had a single good night's sleep. He remembered that 4120 incidents had threatened Louis's life. Was someone truly trying to assassinate him? And if so, who could it be? The world had forgotten about dragons, and only a few xenomorphs were still aware of their existence. How could anyone harm Louis without realizing the consequences? Only dragons had such power, but those who knew about them, especially the nearby clans, would protect their hatchlings with their lives. So Jean convinced himself that it must all be a coincidence. But then he recalled an incident from the past. He had once fought off a group of creatures attempting to invade his castle. They were human knights, and as they charged toward him, Jean used his powers to blind them with a burst of light. However, nothing happened as expected. Suddenly, spikes erupted from their bodies, killing them instantly. Jean spoke with Pamis about it, and Pamis explained that such things couldn't be avoided. Genius will always face many obstacles, trials, and regulations. Lewis will face similar challenges in the future, just as the first Dragon King did. Jean wondered if this was true. Was Lewis's talent so overpowering that others were trying to remove him? But no matter what it was, whether fate or something else, Jean made a vow. He would protect Lewis from anything. The scene shifted to the present, where Lewis was staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had grown a bit, but he was frustrated. He had been asleep for 100 years, and in all that time he had only grown a little. He hadn't paid much attention before, but now that he realized how much time he had lost minus 100 years of his life, it made him angry. And yet, he was still alive despite coming close to death daily. It seemed that sleeping had kept him safe, but Lewis didn't know what to make of it. No matter how it happened, though, the important thing was that he was still alive. Just then, Jean entered with dinner, telling Lewis to get ready and come downstairs. Lewis agreed, but couldn't help wondering what was wrong with his father. Was he getting older? Lewis guessed that he was, and it made him feel a bit melancholic. Jean said that it was good and he will be a good hatchling and listen to him from here on out. Lewis called out to his father, asking him to wait because he was hungry. They both headed downstairs together. Lewis, still curious, asked why Jean seemed so tired. Jean replied by asking if he really seems tired. As time passed, Lewis had now reached the point where he could take on a human form. He was practicing with his sword under a tree outside, testing its pressure with each swing. Suddenly, someone approached and called out to him as master. He turned to see a small fairy approaching, covered with a towel. As he reached for it, he realized the fairy was exhausted. She mentioned that Lewis had become accustomed to his human form and was, in fact, the president of the Holy and Great Dragon Plan. Noticing his tension, she asked what was troubling him. He replied that it had already been 100 years and requested that she stop calling him master. Her name was Finn, and she explained that he was truly her master. For the fairies, honoring superior dragons was a great pleasure. Lewis reflected on this, remembering that after his first hibernation, he had been reading in his room when he heard a strange sound. Upon investigating, he found a gift box. He wondered what the noise had been, and from inside the box, Finn emerged, shouting that there was no oxygen. Startled, Lewis reacted by striking her with his tail, sending her crashing into the wall. As she fell, he wondered if she was some kind of giant fly. He prodded her with a stick, curious about what she was. Finn then properly greeted him as the baby holy dragon and introduced herself as Finn, a member of the Royal Starlight Fairies. She expressed her honor in being the one to bring him pleasure in the future. Lewis didn't quite understand what she meant, so she asked him to put her down. He complied, sitting down as he asked her what she meant by pleasure. She then revealed a set she had prepared, explaining that the Starlight Fairies had painstakingly created it for him. It was a version 0.23 fairy disguise, utilizing the fairy family's genderless nature. The set included clothes suitable for both men and women, demons and celestial beings, with a variety of options including some limited edition sets. But the most impressive part, she said, was herself. As a noble Starlight Fairy with a perfect body, she could pull off any outfit. Lewis realized it was a doll set and wondered if he could use her as a living doll. She smiled and confirmed that he was indeed the holy, great, and wise baby dragon, and he had guessed correctly. He immediately dismissed the idea, asking his father why he would give him such a gift. It seemed to be the most desired gift among hatchlings. They didn't mind playing with fairies like dolls in a fantasy world or staging wars. However, the thought of using a living creature as a doll felt creepy to Lewis, so he planned to return it. But then Finn started crying, asking why he was treating her this way. She promised to do anything for him, even washing his laundry, and begged him not to throw her away. It turned out that being friends with him was a great honor, a guaranteed path to greatness, and the first fabrication that unified the Pharaoh lines was the first Dragon King's childhood toy. After days of crying and begging, Finn was accepted as a subordinate. The scene shifted to the present, where Finn asked him what he was thinking. Lewis thought to himself that Finn, being 800 years old, knew far more than he did, and surprisingly, she was quite helpful with the little things. He dismissed it, saying it was nothing, and mentioned that after his exercise, he was heading back to the study. Finn asked for a minute of his time. Lewis thought she had a natural talent for spatial manipulation with an uncanny ability to store things in subspace like his personal set of drawers. She then pulled out a book, mentioning that he was going to study about the separation and manifestation of mana, an advanced course. He thanked her for the gesture. She managed everything around him efficiently, and he was glad to see she was so comfortable in her role. She arranged his meals, and Lewis thought he would have to get used to this new arrangement soon. After a while, he noticed dark clouds gathering in the sky. "It's been a few days," he murmured, "and it's coming again." The rain started to fall, and Finn grew worried about him. A lightning strike suddenly surged toward him, but he used a bracelet on his wrist to absorb the bolt, casually mentioning that he had been struck by lightning hundreds of times already. Finn was shocked to see that the bracelet he wore contained a thunder elemental stone. Lewis thought to himself that it utilized a phenomenon where the purer and stronger the power, the weaker it flowed. The stone was a low-grade elemental stone, relatively unstable. As it absorbed more lightning, it started to fill up. He remarked that it was already full and that he needed to replace it, but Finn immediately protested. Another lightning strike came hurtling toward him, and he raised a barrier to protect himself. Once again, Finn was astonished by the spatial distortion field he created. It was an advanced spiritual distortion field moving so quickly that it nearly resembled Tier 1 magic. Even a mana-blessed dragon would find it difficult, but Lewis could do it with ease. She realized that with him, she could write an epic history for her entire fairy clan to listen to. Lewis reflected on how grateful he was for his studies on spatial shields. What had once seemed like life-threatening incidents were now easily avoided. His spatial abilities were approaching Tier 1 with space and time nearing Tier 3. However, his mental abilities were still at Tier 5. He had focused so much on spatial abilities for survival that he had neglected his other attributes. Though he knew it would take time, he could now see a glimmer of hope. He was confident he would survive, and he decided it was time to start anew. He then turned to Finn and asked for the next book. As Lewis and Jean were having their meal, Lewis asked where his father was going. Jean replied that he had to go to Silverflower's castle since Kurdaker was retiring that month. Lewis wondered, was that Grandpa? Jean confirmed, saying that Kurdaker was indeed retiring, but he thought calling him Grandpa was a bit much. Lewis responded that his grandpa's friend was essentially his grandpa too. Jean seemed to think it was all a bit too much, but Lewis asked why Jean needed to go there. Jean then revealed that he would be taking Kurdaker's position. Jean looked pleased, proudly stating that his father was very powerful. He added that if Lewis said so, that it must be true. Lewis reflected on this, realizing that he wasn't the only one who had grown over the years. His father had always been top tier, but now after achieving Tier 0 in dark attributes, a feat even the average dragon couldn't accomplish, Jean had truly reached another level. His father had reached this power at the young age of 4,000, which for a dragon was remarkable enough to make him a true final boss. In the original story, Jean, known as the Berserker who ravaged the continent, had two main attributes, darkness and magic. With these powers, Jean's entire body became engulfed in black energy, earning him the title of the Second Coming of the Devil. However, Lewis was determined to prevent this outcome. His father had been training relentlessly for the last 150 years to ensure it didn't happen, and Lewis was committed to helping him stay on the right path. Jean then called Lewis over about to say something. Lewis wondered what it was, and Jean stated that while normally the parents of hatchlings weren't chosen for such roles, no one else was capable of taking his place. The succession process would take a long time, around 10 years. Lewis was taken aback and felt a wave of sadness at the thought. Jean came over, trying to reassure him, saying that it would pass quickly. Lewis tried to remain upbeat, thinking that, yes, it would be 10 years, but in the grand scheme of things, that was only a decade. He recently started studying the lawlessness theory, so he hoped to speed things up. However, as he looked at his father, sitting there with a disappointed expression, Louis asked that if he think Lewis was going to cry and beg him not to go. Jean stood up and not knowing what to expect from his son, and asked if they want anything else to eat. He then added to just give him a second, and he will grab some more snacks for them. Lewis, feeling a bit exasperated, replied that he wasn't a child. Finally, as Jean prepared to leave, standing outside with Lewis, he mentioned that the nutritional pills were in the freezer, so don't skip meals just to practice. He also added that the emergency first aid kit was in the third drawer of his room in case he gets sick, so just take it. Lewis reluctantly agreed, asking Jean to leave now. Jean had been repeating the same things for an hour, but Lewis wasn't a kid anymore. He would only be alone for 10 years. Jean, still thinking of Lewis as a child, handed him a stone, explaining that it was a communication stone. The stone came in pairs and, when energized, would allow them to communicate no matter where Jean was. Lewis looked at the stone, noting how expensive it seemed, and asked if they would still be able to communicate even while Jean was at Silverflower's castle. Jean didn't respond immediately, turning away and muttering that it wasn't something Lewis should worry about. Lewis reflected on how the smartest people often handled things in a similar manner. He chuckled and told his father not to worry about him, just to focus on his projects. Jean agreed, saying he should get going, but that if Lewis needed anything, he could always look for it in Jean's room. Before flying away, Jean added that Lewis could also read his books if he got bored, reminding him not to skip meals, eat well, and stay inside because it was dangerous outside the city. As Jean left, Lewis sighed, thinking to himself that his father was a tough cookie. He remembered how Jean had protected him from countless threats over the past 100 years, and while it was understandable that his father would worry, Lewis was now on his own for a while. He was happy, though, that it was his castle now. While reading a book, Lewis reflected on the times he thought he'd be alone forever. Meanwhile, Finn was in distress, terrified of two people who were approaching her. She called out for Lewis to help. As they neared, she begged them not to come closer, But the two people, grinning ominously, grabbed her. She continued calling for Lewis. Just then Lewis appeared, asking the two what they were doing. The two strangers were thrilled to see him and revealed they were twins. As they both began speaking at once, Lewis interrupted, asking them to take turns. The girl introduced herself as Kenny and said that Jean had gone to Silverflower's castle, leaving them behind. Con the boy added that Jean would be back in 10 years and that Lewis must be worried about being alone. They thought they'd visit him to keep him company and have some fun. Kenny mentioned they were fine, but Lewis looked bored. Lewis then asked them to leave. Con was surprised and asked why he was being so mean. Kenny echoed the sentiment, saying Lewis shouldn't say such things. Lewis thought about the twins. They lived on a neighboring peak and were the tunnel twin dragons, born 10,000 years apart. He was frustrated because, for some unknown reason, his father had introduced them to him. He had initially found them cute with their silver hair and chubby cheeks, and had even enjoyed playing with them for a while. But now they kept showing up without him asking, harassing him in his own space. He thought he would finally be able to practice on his own. He wondered why his father had put him through this. The twins, oblivious to his irritation, mentioned that they had come to play because they thought he'd be bored. They seemed disappointed when Lewis acted coldly toward them. Con then pulled out his sword, saying he'd brought toys for Lewis. Lewis immediately rushed over to take it, recognizing the sword. He asked that where did they get this. The twins were confused by his question, not understanding why Lewis was so concerned. Con explained that he had taken the sword from his father's storage room. Cammy agreed with his statement. Lewis then asked that if they get permission from Uncle Carol's. When neither of them responded, Lewis understood that they had sneaked it. He examined the sword and noticed it was a magic sword with a special attribute stone that contained far more power than he had. At the top of the grip, there was a magic circle, and he asked Finn what she thought of it. Finn replied that the sword was broken and had lost its function. While she didn't know exactly what had happened, she recognized it was a very high-level spell. She had seen many subspace swords and staffs like it, but the complexity of the circle suggested the subspace contained a very large volume. Lewis wondered about it and decided to test it for himself. He thought that since the sword had come from the dragon's treasure trove, there must be something extraordinary hidden within the subspace, and he was determined to claim it. A few hours later, Con and Cammy were lying on the floor, bored, while Lewis sat focused on fixing the sword. They both wondered when the process would be over. Finally, Lewis announced that he had fixed it. Everyone became excited, and Cammy asked him to test it. Lewis said he would first push the elemental power, and as he did so, he was surprised by how much more energy there was than he had anticipated. He wondered what could be stored there. The energy began to accumulate, creating a portal-like formation. Lewis suspected it was the subspace. The portal then opened, pulling all four of them into it. They were summoned to a high point in an icy cave and all fell to the ground. However, Finn was fine, having flown gracefully. She asked if everyone was okay. Lewis looked around, confused, and asked that where they were at, is this a cave? As he examined the sword, he noticed that the magic stone had broken down. Con started crying, realizing that Lewis had broken the sword. Lewis explained that it was not a sword, it's an attribute stone. But Con only cried louder, upset that Lewis had broken the attribute stone. Lewis then turned to Cammy and asked if she knew who this sword belonged to. Cammy replied that she had heard it belonged to her great-grandmother. Lewis wondered if her great-grandmother had been a spatial mage, but Cammy didn't know anything about it. Lewis grew concerned. He realized that to use this sword effectively, he needed to understand its purpose and how it worked. From a distance, Finn called out to them, mentioning that there was something ahead. They all went to check, and it turned out to be another sword. Lewis observed it and said that it isn't a subspace treasure trove, but rather an interdimensional gate that connects two different places. Finn agreed, saying she had suspected the same. Lewis felt that he should have been more cautious and less complacent. As he began to move, Cammy asked that where he was going. Lewis replied that he needed to find out where they were so they can get back home. He began walking ahead, motioning for them to follow. They moved ahead and soon encountered a terrifying obstacle blocking their path. Lewis decided to use his power to blast it away. As Con and Cammy continued forward, Lewis noticed the snow around them and felt the biting cold. He pressed on, determined to move ahead, but Con called out, asking that where he was going. Lewis was surprised to see what lay outside. The others came over to join him, and Con wondered aloud, what's going on? Finn, too, asked Lewis that what happened. Lewis stared at the distant mountain, contemplating if it was the Earth's right fang. Con was shocked by what Lewis said and asked that what do he mean. Cammy explained that Lewis was referring to the left fang, and they had ended up at the Earth's right fang. Lewis reminded everyone that the world was called Evan, which was divided into 4 continents, each with a consistent climate throughout the year. The spring continent had mild weather year-round. The December continent, with its tropical-like climate, was constantly scorched by the sun. The autumn continent experienced a cooler climate with abundant sunshine, and it had been enjoying bountiful harvests for centuries. Finally, there was the winter continent, known for its cold, harsh climate, bitter winds, and heavy snowfall. After describing these continents, Lewis mentioned Jean's home, the Naki Mountain Range, located at the westernmost tip of the spring continent. He explained that they were at the complete opposite end of the winter continent, near the right fang of the earth, situated at the easternmost tip. Jean was overwhelmed with emotion upon hearing this. While he could accept the idea of reincarnation, he wondered whether he could endure it. Constantly feeling threatened by the outside world, full of dangers, was daunting. He hadn't intended to leave the house, but now he feared what might happen if someone discovered he had disappeared from the castle. What if his father had turned into a berserker? Jean took out the communication stone and guessed that it wouldn't work for long-range communication. He called Finn and asked whether it would be possible to cross the East Sea. She responded that it was not. The East Sea was a demonic sea, the legacy of the worst evil dragons. It separated the winter continent from the spring continent, a dangerous place where all sorts of demons lurked and even adult dragons avoided it. Despite Lewis being chosen by the four elements, at his age, crossing the sea was impossible. Lewis nodded, acknowledging this, but he had only been asking out of curiosity. He then asked how long it would take to cross the continent and reach the left fang. Finn wasn't sure, but if they walked, it would take about 10 years. Lewis thought to himself that if he hurried, he might return before his father came back. He then called the twins' brats and told them they were in deep trouble. The right fang, located at the eastern edge of the winter continent, was a 10-year journey on foot. Cammy suggested they fly. Lewis sarcastically asked if she wanted to get kidnapped. Cammy, confused by his response, asked for clarification. Lewis firmly stated that they wouldn't fly, they would travel like humans and take 10 years to get there. Khan raised his hand and asked, "What if they don't make it back in 10 years? Lewis, trying to sound intimidating, replied if their father isn't back by then, and they were still not found, he will set the entire continent on fire searching for them. Cammy then asked why they would do that. Lewis, thinking they weren't behaving like humans, replied that they were going to beat the crap out of them. He added that they might not buy them any snacks or toys for 100 years. The twins immediately grew worried. Lewis couldn't help but think that their snacks and toys were more precious to them than the well-being of the entire continent. He stated that they just needed to get home before their fathers returned, and from that point on, he was in charge. He told them to listen to him. Cammy and Khan immediately started fighting for the position of leader. Lewis, irritated, told them that leadership should go to the smartest dragon. If they thought they were smarter than him, they were welcome to try. Both Cammy and Khan pointed out that Lewis was younger than them. Lewis retorted that they were just children who had escaped, and besides, he was taller than them. Cammy was only a month older, and Lewis had claimed the title of boss because he said so first. The three of them bickered, while Finn watched them, commenting that they had a long way to go. After a moment, Lewis firmly declared that he would be the leader from now on and that everything was settled. "Now let's go," he said. Just as Lewis was about to take charge, he noticed dark rain clouds approaching. He quickly put on the thunderstone, remarking that it had been a while. Khan and Cammy hugged him, asking if he was going to be struck by lightning again. They jokingly added that they wanted to be struck too. Lewis pushed them away, thinking they had no idea how bad it was to be struck by lightning. Despite his efforts to push them off, they held on to him and he warned them not to let go. He felt that the lightning this time would be stronger than before, so they would need to brace for what was coming. But nothing happened. They all stood there confused. Lewis wondered if the lightning bolt had missed. Just then, he heard a noise and turned around only to be shocked by what he saw. A massive snowberg was falling from a great height. He was worried about it, but Khan and Cammy were excited, thrilled by the sight of so much snow. Lewis quickly lifted both of them and started running, urging them to transform quickly. The snow was dangerously close to them. Lewis used his power of disconnection to encase the three of them in a protective box, and with the pressure of the snow, they were carried away. Cammy and Khan were thrilled by the experience. After a while, they all emerged from the snow. Lewis, shaken, commented that he thought he was going to die. Both twins, still excited, said it was the most fun they'd had and asked if they could do it again. Frustrated, Lewis hit them both and told them to grow up. He then wondered where the avalanche had brought them. Looking around, he saw that the roads were completely covered by snow, leaving them unable to recognize their location. No wonder they couldn't tell where they were. Meanwhile, the twins were still having fun, with Khan saying it was like a giant snow pool and getting ready to dive in. Cammy, finding it equally exciting, was about to dive in too. As they were playing, Lewis called them out, telling them to come out because they had a long journey ahead. When no one responded, he became angry and wondered what kind of prank they were playing. He approached the spot where they had dove in, but as he went to step, he suddenly fell in. Panicking, he grabbed Finn and asked her to fly him out. Finn assured him that it would be easy, but as Lewis slid down, he wondered when it would stop. Finn urged him to look ahead. Lewis then saw a cliff and realized he was about to slide right off it. In that moment, both Cammy and Khan, now in dragon form, swooped in to lift him up. They set him down safely and returned to their human forms, laughing and commenting on how fun it was. Lewis, now with a bit of respect for them, remarked that he was starting to admire them. Finn agreed, nodding her head. Lewis, still a bit bewildered, wondered where they were. Finn observed that it didn't look like a natural cave, but rather a man-made corridor. Lewis agreed, saying it was his first time there, yet the place felt oddly familiar. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen it before. Finn asked what they should do next. Lewis suggested they take their time and think carefully, as rushing might take them further from the exit. But the twins, full of energy, rushed ahead, convinced they might have found the exit. Lewis warned them to slow down and was about to remind them to listen to the captain when he noticed that the twins had stopped moving. Wondering why, he approached them and saw that they were staring ahead. Kavy pointed and asked that what were those. Lewis looked up and was shocked to see knights standing before them, led by a terrifying figure with glowing eyes that glared at them. The sight of the knights and the ominous figure left them all frozen with fear. Lewis wondered who these mysterious figures were. Finn suggested that there were more of them than they initially thought. As they stepped forward a bit, Khan asked if they were truly human. Kami called him a fool, pointing out the humans didn't have red light in their eyes. Lewis, still unsure, wondered if they were the Winter General's forces. Before the webtoon story had begun, the heroic King Valentia had saved everyone from a world crisis. Afterward, even in the afterlife, he was said to be guarded by the overworked Winter General, who was believed to appear near the ice tomb of the great hero king. Lewis realized the place they were in was not far from his home, and it seemed like a coincidence. He then recalled that if this was truly the king's tomb, it could also mean that items from the webtoon could be here. Finn called out, warning that the enemy seemed a bit too aggressive. Lewis, unfazed, called to Khan and Kami, telling them to take care of the attackers. The twins nodded and rushed into battle with their swords. Khan leaped forward, announcing that he would go first. As he swung his sword at one of the knights, the knight tried to block with its weapon, but Khan's strength was so immense that he broke the weapon and cleaved the knight in two, killing it instantly. Kami, slightly disappointed, pouted because she wanted to go first. Another knight attempted to attack her from behind. Kami swiftly turned around and unleashed several slashes, blasting the knight away. Lewis observed their battle and remarked that they were doing well. He noted that their strengths seemed to be on par with the second-tier samurai. He no longer doubted their abilities, but to speed things up, he decided to use his temporal law skill to slow down time. With this power, he also tied the weapons of the remaining enemies, making it difficult for them to lift their weapons. Khan quickly realized the enemies were slowing down, and Kami deduced that Lewis must have enhanced their weapons with his temporal crystal. Khan grinned and said that if that was the case, they should take advantage of the situation and finish them all off. The twins rushed forward, attacking with incredible speed, quickly dispatching the remaining knights. Khan laughed and remarked that they were popping like popcorn. Finally, only one knight remained, looking terrified. The twins worked together to blast it away, and with that, all of their enemies were defeated. Khan sighed, feeling a little down. Is it really over already? He wondered aloud. Kami, equally unimpressed, declared she was bored. Lewis, ever the strategist, praised them both for their skills, but then asked that didn't they too want to try something a bit more fun? The twins looked at him in confusion, unsure of what he meant. Finn made the arrangements for tea for Lewis, and he mentioned how delicious it was. Finn thanked him and then glanced at the twins, who were engaged in a battle with the traps ahead of them. She remarked that it was quite fun, and Kami agreed with her. Lewis signaled to them, indicating that arrows were coming from the right and told them to dodge. Khan responded by slicing through the arrows. Lewis then warned Kami to watch out for blades on the left, which she quickly dealt with as well. They then noticed a giant boulder rolling toward them. Both Kami and Khan shattered it with their swords, declaring that they were finished and that nothing else was coming their way. Finn was surprised that such dangerous traps and generals were all part of this place. Though they were young, they were still dragons. Lewis stood up, seemingly missing the moment and remarking that they were almost done here. Finn packed up the things from the storage and asked where they were. Lewis explained that it was the Hero King's tomb. Finn was shocked by this and confirmed if it was the resting place of Hero King Valentia. Lewis affirmed, saying it was indeed where Valentia was buried. The place was essentially a dungeon, filled with monsters and traps designed to ward off intruders who sought to disturb the king's rest. Once they overcame all the traps and obstacles, navigating through numerous passageways, they would reach the heart of the tomb. There, countless sweet rewards awaited them, as it was designed to provide starting equipment for adventurers at the beginning of their journey. It was a beginner-level dungeon, and Lewis was certain no one had visited this place yet. He was excited, knowing that all the rewards would be his. He then told the twins that they were almost done and to keep moving forward. As they proceeded, they noticed the vastness of the space ahead. Kami called out to Lewis, mentioning that something was ahead, and Khan added that it was huge and ugly. Lewis agreed, recognizing it as the Ten Giant, the final boss. He speculated that it was the original one and then turned his attention to the door, sensing that the treasure was behind it. He called the twins, who readied themselves for battle. Lewis thought they made a great pair, showing no signs of fear in the face of such a massive enemy. The dragons were destined to rise to the top from the moment they took flight, and right then, those young ones bared their teeth, looking down upon their foes with fierce determination. Lewis wondered if they understood what he meant. The twins nodded and agreed that it was the best way forward. Lewis told them to end it. As one of the bosses lunged at them, the twins slashed at it with their swords while Lewis used a burst attack to strike it down. The twins continued to battle the others, and Lewis used his time-slowing abilities more and more to assist them. Finn marveled at how amazing they were. After defeating all the enemies, Khan and Cammy relaxed, with Khan mentioning that it was fun. Cammy, feeling satisfied, said she was going to get a good night's sleep. Lewis suggested they go check the reward. Cammy and Khan eagerly asked him to open the gate. As Lewis opened it, they were greeted by a vast treasure trove. Khan quickly entered, remarking that there was more treasure here than in his father's entire storage room. He dove into the mountain of gold coins, enjoying the sight and feel of it. Cammy and Finn watched the coins in awe. Finn called Lewis over to look at the treasure, but she found that he had already moved ahead to see the resting place of Hero King Valencia. Finn remarked that so many years had passed, yet Valencia was still alive. They noticed something written on the board, and Lewis wondered if it was in the ancient winter language. He recalled the words. From the origin, the creatures of light and darkness were born. They were designed as good and evil. As the remaining light and darkness intertwined, chaos ensued. In the midst of this turmoil, a distinct boundary emerged, separating the good from the evil. Then the earth was created, and they were born from both sources, the good and the evil creations who called themselves exalted beings. These beings were unaware of the world below and only dreamed of dominating each other. The conflict between good and evil caused suffering for all the other beings on Earth. Eventually, those on Earth who could not bear it drew their swords against the good and evil. The dragons led the way, followed by humans and half-breeds. After much struggle, the victorious earthly beings scattered to the continents of the four seasons. With time, they forgot about the good and evil, and the dragons took up the task of vigilance. But the Hero King Valencia warned everyone that the dragons who sacrificed themselves for peace would return to the world, as would the forces of good and evil. They would bring the chaos once more. As the last generation who had heard of the war, he left the responsibility to them, asking them to pass down the story. Lewis wondered if a demonic war truly took place in the original universe. He was frustrated that the king had left such a task to them. He then looked at the book placed there and thought it was the Book of Lawlessness of Hero King Valencia. Valencia was an unorthodox genius who reached the 0 tier in a human body. This theoretical book contained everything Valencia had accomplished in his life. It was not an exaggeration to say that, compared to this book, all the treasures in the world were insignificant. Lewis glanced at the treasure mountain and thought it would be a shame to leave it behind. He decided to take some for himself. Just as he was collecting a few, the barrier that had sealed Valencia broke. Shocked, Lewis muttered, "This was ridiculous." Valencia was awake. Valencia glared at him, and Lewis thought, this wasn't mentioned in the original story. Valencia moved toward him, clearly asserting that he was not the property of anyone. The twins, shocked, rushed to Lewis, asking that what was that. Lewis replied, "That's Hero King Valencia." Ken was taken aback by this revelation. Lewis confirmed, saying Valencia was a tier 0 warrior, so we can't deal with him right now. Khan was astonished to hear that a human could be a tier 0. Lewis quickly suggested to let's transform into dragons. Valencia's voice cut through the tension as he said that for the greedy ones only death awaits. As he prepared to attack, Lewis felt a surge of fear and thought he'd have to run, but his legs trembled and refused to move, and was that the effect of a tier 0. He looked at the twins, who seemed equally worried. This isn't the time to be ridiculous, Lewis thought, and had he trained that much just to die here? Then he gathered his strength, determined not to give up. As Valencia moved in for the attack, Lewis countered with his own power, shouting, "I want to live." He was surprised to find that his attack actually struck Valencia. For a moment he thought he had the upper hand, but before he could celebrate, Valencia's sword struck him with deadly force, the pressure from the blow even reaching Finn. After the attack, Finn looked around, noticing a giant gap separating them. Worried about Lewis, she called out to him. Lewis stood there, alive, and wondered if he was truly still alive. Finn rushed to hug him, crying in relief that he was fine. He then wondered how he had survived. He looked around at the destruction caused by Valencia's attack. Cammy then called out, asking Lewis to look up. He was shocked to see that the ceiling of the cave had been split by that sword strike. He wondered, can a single human really do that? Then Lewis speculated that Valencia must have changed the direction of his slash at the last moment. Valencia lowered his sword and, addressing them as young dragons, told them to protect. Lewis was confused, wondering what he meant by protect them, and what it all meant. Valencia told them to leave and be careful. Lewis questioned what he had just said. The tomb began to collapse, and Finn urged Lewis to move, to get them out of there. Lewis hesitated, then saw Valencia begin to disappear. The twins were terrified, wondering if they were going to die. Lewis realized it wasn't the time to hesitate. He transformed into his dragon form and ordered them to get up as well. The twins transformed into dragons and they fled the collapsing tomb. Lewis urged them not to fall behind. As they flew, Finn suddenly shouted for Lewis to look ahead. A massive ice shard was heading toward them. Lewis used his reality split ability to break it into small pieces. They saw a pathway leading upward and rushed to escape. Once they were safely flying in the sky, Khan spoke up, saying he thought they were going to die down there. He wondered what had happened inside. He was certain the Hero King was going to kill them, but stopped himself. If he hadn't, they might all have died. Lewis reflected on what Valencia had said about dealing with intruders and wondered why he'd stopped. He was more curious about what the Hero King had been trying to say before he disappeared. But for now, Lewis was just glad they had survived, and that he had even managed to take the book he wanted. Finn then called out to Lewis, telling him that the twins were still struggling. They were scared, and Lewis suggested they find a place to rest. They all shifted back to human form and landed on the snow-covered ground. Lewis reassured them, saying, "I think we're going to survive." The twins were still crying, and Lewis realized that though he had been surprised too, the youth had made the experience all the more terrifying for them. He handed them both a pill, saying that they were definitely out of mana. The twins took the pill, and Lewis thought about how he was out of mana as well. He hadn't run out like this since his reincarnation. He then lay down, spreading his arms out, and said, "It's time to rest." The twins crawled over to use his arms as pillows and slept together. Finn looked at them and said, "We should all get some rest." The next morning, both twins were excited to play in the snow and were tossing snowballs at each other. Lewis asked if it wasn't getting boring since it had been snowing everywhere since the previous day. Finn replied that considering everything they had been through, they were still full of energy. Lewis agreed but thought that Finn just wanted to praise the dragons. He then turned to look at the Fang and remarked that they had reached a deserted area where there wasn't even a house. He wondered if there were any monsters on the winter continent, as they hadn't encountered any so far. Finn disagreed, explaining that the winter continent actually had more monsters than any other, and due to the cold climate, food was scarce. He added that there were countless stories of monsters hunting humans for food. Lewis asked why they hadn't seen any monsters on the way down. Finn suggested it might have been because of the 3 dragons traveling with them. No monster was brave enough to approach. Lewis mentioned that there was no need to hide their aura for now. Suddenly, Khan pointed into the distance and called Lewis' attention to some smoke. Lewis was excited to see it and immediately suggested they go investigate. As they approached, they discovered a small village was on fire. Finn expressed concern, suggesting the village had been attacked. She asked what they should do. Lewis suggested they head down there, as there might be some survivors. He went to check and found monster corpses, confirming that it was indeed a monster attack. Finn joined him and asked if he had found anything. He replied that he didn't think there were any survivors. Then the twins arrived and mentioned there was nothing left and they were still hungry. Lewis handed them some pills, telling them it had been a long day and they should eat. Just then, they heard footsteps. Lewis noticed a few knights walking in their direction and quickly took the twins to hide behind a nearby house. Cammy wondered why they were hiding, and Khan asked if Lewis was afraid of humans again. Lewis replied that he wasn't afraid of them, but he didn't want their dangerous situation to get tangled up with random events. He told them to hide their aura and emphasized that they needed to be careful not to get caught. The leader of the knights arrived on horseback with a carriage following behind. The knights reported that it appeared to be a monster attack, and there were no survivors. The leader said he would report to the Archduke personally. He went to the carriage and called for the Archduke. The Archduke replied that he had already been informed and would come to investigate the situation himself. Then the Archduke came down and asked his wife if she was sure she wanted to see it for herself, especially considering the situation. She replied that, as the wife of the Archduke, it was her duty as the mistress of the land to confront the souls of those harmed in her domain. He agreed if that was what she wanted. So the Archduchess descended as well. As she stepped out, she was reminded of the horrific incident that had occurred before, and she felt a sense of unease. The Archduke supported her, but she reassured him, saying she was fine. He suggested it would be best if she went inside to rest. She asked if he was trying to make her feel uncomfortable. He responded that after 10 years together, he still couldn't go against her stubbornness. She smiled brightly and said that the one who loves more usually loses. Then she turned to the general of the knights and asked if there were any survivors. The general confirmed there were none, explaining that at present, most monsters were less active, but for some reason, they had started going on a rampage the day before. It was as though they were being chased by a superior being. The Archduke took responsibility, saying that if he had mobilized the village sooner, this might not have happened. His wife reassured him, saying it wasn't his fault and that he shouldn't be too hard on himself. Lewis wondered if the state of the village was a result of his own actions and whether his conscience was being pierced. At that moment, the twins growled and the knights heard the sound. The general, curious, called out to see who was there. "Just come out," he ordered. The guards stood on alert, and Lewis wondered if this was some kind of motivational story about parenting. The general warned them that if they didn't come out, he would destroy the house. Lewis wondered what he should do, realizing they couldn't just stay hidden. The general said this was their final warning, and whatever happened next would be their responsibility. He then swung his sword, preparing to attack the house. The house broke apart, forcing Lewis to step back, and Finn flew out of the way as well. Lewis, with the twins, stood there, and the general was shocked to see the three children. The Archduchess remarked, so there were surviving children. Lewis thought it was a good sign, and then he started crying. The twins were confused, and Lewis asked them to do the same. They began acting as well. The Archduchess was kind towards them, and the twins ran to her, saying how scared they were. Lewis thought the twins were much smarter than him. He wondered if all the foolish things they usually did were just acts. The Archduke asked Lewis if they were the only survivors. Lewis confirmed, and the Archduke stated that they had been through far too much. The Archduchess suggested they take the children back to the castle. The Archduke agreed, ordering the general to escort the children back to the castle. Lewis was shocked, and as they were being escorted away, Finn watched them. The scene shifted to the giant bathtub at the castle, where Lewis was bathing. He wondered how things had ended up like this. He had hoped they could escape by pretending to be pitiful, but the twins had done it so well. He didn't realize that these people were so kind and would go to such lengths to help them. Lewis decided to observe the situation first and look for an opportunity. The twins were also in the bath having fun. They threw water at Lewis, making fun of his wet hair. Lewis was relieved that they seemed carefree. Then two maids entered to help them, complimenting their fair skin and calling them cute. Lewis thought it was so noisy around. The maids mentioned it was time for them to change clothes and head to the dining area. After changing, they went to the dining room where the Archduchess was already sitting. She was surprised and remarked that she barely recognized them. She then invited them to sit and eat, saying they must be hungry. The twins rushed to the food and began eating eagerly. Lewis wondered why the twins had adapted so quickly to their new environment. He thought they might have to leave soon, but he couldn't act hastily. Things could go wrong, especially with Finn, and he wondered where she was now. The scene shifted to Finn, who was flying swiftly, thinking that the garage was surely headed in the direction she was flying. She needed to return to Lewis. If only she hadn't been captured by those snow eagles, she wouldn't have missed him. She thought about Lewis, hoping he could wait just a little longer. She was on her way. That night, Lewis was walking down a corridor when he noticed a room with the door slightly ajar and light spilling out. He heard voices from inside. The conversation sounded tense. "We can't keep those children with us forever," a voice said. Curious, Lewis quietly approached to listen, and he saw that it was the Archduke and his wife. The Archduchess said that hearing the voices of the children reminded her. The Archduke responded, understanding her feelings, but said that it wasn't right to attach their deceased child's memory to these children. He gently asked her to let go of her. The Archduchess cried and asked how he could ask a mother to forget her child. Lewis realized then that she must have recently lost a child, which explained why she had been so kind to them. She called the Archduke by his name, Kanta, and asked him to accept the children as their own, son and daughter. Lewis was shocked to hear such a request. Lewis sat in his room, deep in thought. It hadn't been long, but why were they considering adopting him and the twins as their heirs? The Grand Duke of Camber was a member of the royal family of the most powerful country, which ruled the Winter Continent. Being adopted by the Grand Duke meant that he could instantly establish himself as a key figure in the country. It must have been a difficult proposal, especially from the Duke's wife. Perhaps the pain of losing their own child was so great that they were looking for a way to heal. Lewis felt it might be better to leave before things got more complicated, but seeing them act so kindly made him feel uneasy. If only Finn were there, he thought, so he could discuss this with her. Just then, he saw Finn knocking at the window. He rushed to the door to let her in. She greeted him warmly, and he wondered where she had been all this time. She apologized, and he suggested that next time she should stick closer to him. The twins arrived and were happy to see Finn back. After they caught up, Finn suggested they could leave now. Lewis agreed, but he was thinking of staying a little longer. She looked at him confused and asked why they couldn't leave right away. Lewis explained that the people here had been so kind to them. He had also heard that they had recently lost a child, so it would feel strange to just leave so suddenly. Finn looked at him thoughtfully, and he continued, saying that they weren't in an urgent situation. It would be a good opportunity to gather more information about the Winter Continent. Finn thought it was unusual for Lewis to be so composed, but in situations like this, he seemed more vulnerable. Seeing him so affectionate made her want to serve him even more. She smiled and said that if he feel uneasy, then let's do it. Lewis was puzzled by her words, wondering what she meant. Finn explained that dragons have always considered first encounters important. In a way, the Duke and his wife were Lewis's first acquaintances here, so if they could leave a simple gift before leaving, it would be as if the issue of the children was resolved. She suggested that if they created a child, the problem of adoption would be solved. Lewis chuckled and said it was easier to just say it. But creating a child isn't something that can be done easily. He paused and then realized something. It might not be a good idea to give them a child immediately, but if they waited until their child was born, it would be fine for them to leave suddenly without it seeming strange. Lewis nodded, thinking it was a good idea. Finn clarified that it was just a suggestion. Lewis wondered if they should prepare for the next step. Meanwhile, the Archduchess sat on the balcony, sipping tea. The twins approached her, asking to play. She smiled, happy that they seemed bored, and even offered them some cookies. The twins eagerly accepted, delighted by the treat. Lewis watched from a hidden spot, feeling a sense of trust in both the Archduchess and the Archduke. The Duke and his generals were walking down the corridor when the Duke asked them to handle a matter accordingly. He was about to discuss the soldiers' training schedule when he stopped, noticing Lewis looking at him with bright eyes. The Duke asked if Lewis needed anything. Lewis quickly denied. The Duke then asked about the other children. Lewis replied that they were playing with the Archduchess. The Duke asked if Lewis wasn't afraid of him. Lewis denied this, and the Duke thought about how children usually feared him and wouldn't even dare approach him, but Lewis was different, just like his own child. The Duke smiled and lifted Lewis, asking if he wanted to play together. He then took Lewis to his study to find something. The two generals left behind exchanged looks. The first one wondered how long it had been since the Duke had smiled like that. The second one agreed, commenting that the children were like precious gems to him. Meanwhile, Lewis was sitting with the twins, asking if they had completed their mission successfully. They agreed, and Cammy added that they had enjoyed drinking tea and eating cookies with the Archduchess. Lewis appreciated their efforts and then asked Finn about her task. She explained that the Duke usually woke at 5 a.m. to start his duties. Around noon, after lunch, he continued with the remaining tasks, and after dinner, he engaged in training. She continued, saying that the Duke's bedtime was around 11 p.m., and that he contacted his wife about 5 times a day. That was all she had to report. Lewis thanked her for her work. Just then, Cammy called him by his name, and he corrected her, asking her to call him Captain. Camby then asked what his plan was. Shin Khan wondered what making a child had to do with his plans with the Archduchess. Lewis replied that it was precisely why he couldn't deal with the kids, even though they were younger than him. He explained that the couple needed to be encouraged to have a child, and that the Duke and his wife were emotionally distant due to the recent loss of their child. If they spent time laughing and enjoying themselves with the children, it would help lift their spirits. Slowly their sadness would fade, and they'd grow more comfortable with each other. Lewis added that then one night the history will be written. Khan and Cammy were confused and wondered what kind of history would be written that night. Lewis simply said there were things like that, but the kids didn't need to know about it. He then picked up a book and wondered aloud, shouldn't it start for real? Finn wondered about the ship that contained the alchemy formulas for the elixir and its purpose. He replied that he had found it in his father's library while searching for ways to enhance the elixir's effects. He had experimented with numerous elixirs but was caught by his father, who scolded him, and the research was subsequently sealed off. Finn thought to himself, who would have thought that my research to overcome my time-limited life would end up being useful like this? He had discovered an elixir of ecstasy that helped couples overcome boredom, along with a quick solution. He opened an empty wardrobe and asked the twins if anyone was looking for him. They both replied that they didn't know, and Finn continued. He then used his expansion skill inside the wardrobe to create a large space, one that seemed both sufficient and earnest for his needs. Later that night, Finn sneaked into a lab, hiding under a container to ensure no one was around. After lifting the container and confirming no one was nearby, she retrieved the elixir, recalling Lewis' instructions to sprinkle it on the ingredients the Grand Duke and his wife would consume the next day. Lewis had specifically reminded Finn to remember to spread the potion on the ingredients they would eat. Finn wondered how Lewis had known exactly which ingredients they would be eating the following day. She carefully sprinkled the elixir over everything, noting that they were making bread, so she made sure to sprinkle it on the grains as well. Using her magic, she spread the potion over the grains, and with that, her mission was complete. She hurried back to report her success. The next evening, Lewis observed the Duke and his wife's bedroom from a distance. The light was still on, and he thought to himself, if Finn followed my instructions, the food they ate today should have contained the elixir. At that moment, he overheard two maids talking as they walked by, and he hid to listen. One lady mentioned that Dennis had suddenly confessed his feelings. The second lady seemed excited, imagining the reaction of the first. The two maids continued their conversation as they walked away, and Lewis relaxed, murmuring that it's almost time. Inside the Duke's bedroom, the Duke was standing close to his wife. She felt something was off and wondered why her heart was pounding so much that day. The Duke placed his hand on her shoulder affectionately, telling her how beautiful she looked. She smiled and took his hand in return, also feeling affectionate. Lewis, watching from afar, commented, "Tonight will be the night." Just then, the twins appeared and asked Lewis what he was doing there and what he was talking about. Lewis, startled by their arrival, turned to face them. They continued to ask questions, and Lewis quickly took them away, telling them that they didn't need to know about such things. The twins winced as he tugged them by the ears, feeling a sharp sting. Louis believed that everything had been taken care of. The next morning, the Archduchess walked with two of her maids, commenting that it had been a while since the weather had been this sunny. She noticed two more maids rushing about with purpose and asked them what could be keeping them so busy so early in the morning. The maids explained their haste, and the Archduchess made her way to the children's room, inquiring about the strange news that the children were missing. One of the maids started crying, explaining that when they had arrived to work in the morning, the children were nowhere to be found, and they had been searching for them among the people ever since. Another maid approached the Archduchess and informed her that there was a letter on the table. The Archduchess took the letter and began to read its contents. In the letter, Louis wrote that they assumed the Archduchess would be surprised by their disappearance. However, he reminded her that if there was a meeting, there would also be parting, and they were now on separate paths. He sincerely thanked them for their kindness during their time together and hoped that they would soon overcome the sorrow of losing their son. He also mentioned that a new chapter would come into their lives and they should shower as much love on this new life as they had shown them. The Archduchess felt deeply emotional upon reading the letter, realizing that everything had already been set in motion and it was all her fault. She had let her desires burden the children and now they were leaving. But then she thought about the meaning of a new life. A few weeks later, a man delivered good news to the Duke and his wife. The Archduchess was expecting a child. She was astonished, and the Duke, filled with happiness, grabbed her hand. It then dawned on her that this was the new life mentioned in the letter. The Duke remarked that it seemed the children had already known she would conceive a baby. She replied that those children must have been fairies sent by God. The Duke said they couldn't let such a rare opportunity pass and suggested they open the warehouse and distribute bread to the commoners. The workers did as instructed, and the bread was spread among the people. That year, the Archduchess recorded the highest birth rate in history. The unintentional gift, born of someone's small mistake, would later create a butterfly effect, but that was a story for the future. As for Louis and the others who had left, Cammy and Khan were thrilled because they loved to travel and wanted to continue doing so. Louis suggested they should travel for at least another 10 years. Khan, ever the optimist, proposed they travel for around 100 years. Cammy was equally excited at the thought. Louis, slightly irritated, was being encouraged by Finn. He thought they had already wasted too much time, and if unexpected situations kept occurring, their journey would only get longer. To minimize travel time, they needed information to cross the continent quickly, but there was no immediate solution. Cammy then asked why there were no monsters around. Khan confidently declared that he could catch them. Louis replied that there were 3 dragons roaming nearby, emitting a strong smell. He questioned what kind of crazy monster would dare approach them. Khan and Cammy, confused, wondered about the smell, but they hadn't noticed it themselves. Louis told them to just forget about it. Khan and Cammy then speculated about bandits. Louis replied that with such a clear view in every direction, all they could see was snow. Even if there were bandits, where would they come from? It was not as though bandits could suddenly sprout from the ground. The 3 bandits, armed with weapons, ordered the group to stay still and hand over everything they had. Khan and Cammy were tired and remarked that the bandits had appeared suddenly, as if they had sprung up from the ground. Louis, however, was unfazed by the situation. As they looked closer, they realized the bandits were just kids, and the leader struck the second one, saying they were only children. He had been stuck in the cold snow all day simply to catch these kids. Now he wondered what they would do next. The third bandit, noticing the children's decent clothing, suggested they might come from a respectable household. "Let's take them hostage and demand money," he proposed. The leader agreed, thinking it was better than leaving empty-handed. 2 of the bandits moved to capture them. Louis asked if they didn't find something strange about the situation. One of the bandits responded that, "What do you mean? There were just 3 kids here without any adults. It would be easy to deal with them." Louis clarified that he wasn't implying there were adults nearby, but the bandit persisted in asking what he meant. Louis simply asked him to think for a moment. Finn then asked Louis what they should do next. Louis replied that these guys must have looted a nearby village. He should take everything, leaving nothing behind. The twins, eager to take action, suggested they play a game with the bandits. Louis, confused by their suggestion, thought it might not be such a bad idea. If they were going to rob the bandits, it would be more profitable to raid their base. The leader of the bandits turned to the others and demanded to know why they were just standing there. "Seize them now," he ordered. He saw Louis raise both hands in surrender and tell them they would follow quietly as long as they weren't harmed. They continued walking, and one of the bandits told his leader that the kids seemed suspicious. Even though they were being kidnapped, they appeared strangely calm, as if they were taking a stroll without a care in the world. The leader asked what they knew, and they just commented that they needed to make a profit from this, possibly by selling the kids into slavery. The third bandit pointed out that they had finally reached their destination. Ahead of them was a large, joint door. As they entered, Louis observed the intricate craftsmanship of the walls, knowing it was at a level he had only seen at his father's estate. Could this really be the bandits' hideout? The overweight bandit chuckled and remarked that the hideout wasn't all that impressive. It was all built by their boss. Lewis asked more about the boss, but the bandit was about to answer when the leader hit him, scolding him for speaking so carelessly. Why was he telling these kids everything? Keep quiet. The bandit apologized, and the leader ordered him to take the kids and lock them in the prison. Finally, the three were locked up in a dark, damp cell. Lewis turned to Finn and asked her to come out of her hiding spot in his shirt. As she emerged, Lewis told her to search the area thoroughly for anything valuable. She agreed and quickly went off to search. Khan and Cammy sat, dejected, wondering if they would ever get out. Lewis told them to wait quietly until Finn returned. Once she did, they could have some fun. He was sure this must be the bandits' base, and he had no doubt they had hidden treasures somewhere. The thrill of the moment was palpable. Meanwhile, the bandit boss, Pablo, was forging something in another part of the hideout. When the bandits returned, they announced that they were back. Pablo, who seemed to be the leader, asked the man if there was much loot. The man shook his head, explaining that monsters had been scaring off travelers lately, so there hadn't been many opportunities for raids. However, they had caught 3 kids who appeared to come from wealthy families. They could make a good profit either by demanding ransom or selling them into slavery. Pablo smiled, clearly pleased with the idea. Good work, he said, but he was not sure they should do that. If they do, they will be the ones losing our purse strings. Let's sell them off instead. While Luis and the twins rested, the man and Pablo came to show them. Pablo looked at the kids and commented, they really do seem like they're from decent families. Luis observed Pablo closely, noting that he was incredibly strong. With that level of power, he had to be at least a tier 3 or higher. He didn't seem like the typical type to be leading a band of bandits in a place like this. All the bandits sensed something strange about Luis. He noticed their unease and decided to address it. Turning to Pablo, he cheekily called him Chunky Uncle. Pablo, confused, asked if he was talking to Pablo. Luis smirked and responded that who else around here was Chunky. Then he asked Pablo for his full name. The man standing next to Pablo became angry, questioning Luis' audacity. He wonders how were he speaking to him and if he even knew who he was talking to. Pablo simply told him his name. The man, still irritated, asked why Luis was acting so disrespectfully. He suddenly felt a chill run through him and wondered if he was coming down with a cold. The man, confused, asked if Luis meant something else. Luis, sensing he had taken the bait, remained silent. As Pablo began to leave, he told the man to handle the kids and went off to take a rest. Luis called after him by telling to take care and he will meet him later. Pablo quickened his pace and the man called after him to let's go together. After some time, Finn returned. Luis asked how things had been outside. She replied that the warehouse was empty, and instead of finding treasure, she believed the bandits might be starving. Luis realized they were penniless, and their decision to come here had been a mistake, but he remembered hearing that people were the real wealth, even in ancient times. Finn asked that what does that mean? Luis simply shrugged, replying that it's nothing. Then he praised her for her work and told her he'd be out for a moment. Take care of the twins while I'm gone, he instructed. Finn was surprised and asked couldn't she accompany him. Luis shook his head by telling them if she won't be there, those twins will cause trouble as soon as they wake up and he will be back soon. Stay here and watch over them. Though Finn was disappointed, but she agreed to stay. Luis easily broke the cell door with a swift motion and grinned and wondered shall they go catch some suckers. Pablo was resting in his room feeling much better now. He wondered who the kid was as he had never experienced anything like that before. It felt as if he were facing an unbeatable monster, one that paralyzed his entire body, but then he decided not to dwell on it. Why should he be scared of a kid? He thought to himself that perhaps he had lost his edge after resting for so long. Just then, Luis appeared, asking what was so funny. Pablo was shocked to see him outside. Luis waved his hand at Pablo, greeting him once again. Pablo asked how Luis had managed to escape from the prison. Luis casually replied that he had simply walked out. Pablo stood up, grabbed a giant hammer, and warned Luis to stay away. Luis glanced around the room and commented that Pablo was living in quite a nice place. Pablo stated that he didn't know how Luis had gotten out, but he would close his eyes for just a moment, so he asked Luis to leave. Luis teased him, asking that what if he didn't leave. Pablo replied that if Luis didn't leave, he would have no choice but to deal with him until he did. Luis, smirking, said he wasn't going anywhere and dared Pablo to try hitting him. Pablo, now furious, swung the hammer with all his might. But just as he was about to strike, something strange happened. His hand stopped mid-swing. Even the dust in the room seemed to move on its own. Luis wondered what was going on, asking if Pablo wasn't going to hit him after all. Luis taunted he was just a big softy despite his size. Pablo tried again, swinging the hammer, but once more it stopped. Frustrated, he missed his target and struck the side of the room instead. After a few more attempts, he collapsed on the floor, exhausted. Luis asked if he was done already. Pablo, still confused, asked who he was. Luis replied Pablo already knew the answer. Just then, Finn arrived, calling for Luis. She explained that the other dwarves were causing havoc, saying they were bored and she couldn't stop them by herself. Pablo was shocked to see a fairy, and he moved closer to her. She looked at him curiously, commenting that it was odd. She could smell dwarf on him, but his size was more like that of an orc. Lewis explained that Pablo was a half-dwarf, likely born from the union of a human and a dwarf. She wondered how Pablo could be so much larger than a human. Lewis admitted that he didn't know either, as it was quite fascinating. Pablo, still trying to process this, asked how it was possible for him to be a half-dwarf. Lewis grinned and suggested that he probably already know who he was and just try to remember. Pablo remembered his childhood, when his father was forging weapons. His father once told him there was something important the dwarves always kept in mind. If they ever encountered someone in the future whose presence made their legs shake and gave them an uncontrollable urge to obey, they had to run away without looking back. Pablo, confused, asked that what father was talking about. His father explained that he wasn't a pure dwarf. Perhaps, as he had suspected, Pablo might be able to break free from the bonds of blood. But as long as he inherited even a part of his father's blood, he could never be completely free from that bond. So if such a situation ever arose, Pablo would have to flee. Pablo, still not fully understanding, asked that what if he couldn't run away. His father's expression grew serious until if he find himself in a situation where he can't escape, so he will have to do as they say. He placed a hand on Pablo's shoulder by telling to just don't forget. If he encounters such a being, he must run away, and he had born with half-human blood, and father knew he was not a fool. Pablo, deep in thought, and asked that what those people were like. His father shut his mouth, his expression growing wary until their ears were always open, and he could never speak carelessly around them. Pablo stopped reflecting for a moment, then looked at Lewis. His curiosity piqued and asked, was Lewis a dragon? Lewis, without hesitation, nodded with a yes. Lewis believed he had a feeling from the start due to Pablo's size, and it turned out his guess was correct. Ever since he first saw Pablo, Lewis had experienced a sense of déjà vu, similar to when he had watched the dwarfs doing repair work for his father. The dwarfs were an intelligent race, and Lewis had asked his father if it was acceptable to exploit them for free. His father had replied that there was nothing to worry about, it was their comeuppance for what they had done to them for generations, and it was how they called it the bond of blood. Even after further research, Lewis found only one record mentioning how the entire dragon race was almost wiped out because of the dwarfs. He couldn't find any more information, and while it was unfortunate, he concluded that if they had made a mistake that nearly led to the extinction of the mighty dragon race, he didn't need to feel sympathy. Pablo, who was uneasy, warned Lewis not to come any closer. Lewis responded, saying he had heard that the dwarfs' heads instilled fear in dragons because of their blood. From now on, Pablo would be his lackey. Pablo was terrified for himself. Finn remarked that Lewis was openly calling Pablo a lackey. Overwhelmed, Pablo fell to his knees, crying. Lewis patted him gently and told him it was fine. That's just how life goes. He then asked Pablo's age. Pablo replied that he would turn 50 that year. Lewis remarked that Pablo was still so young, then revealed that he was 250 years old. Pablo was shocked and wondered aloud if that meant Lewis was still a hatchling. Lewis, clearly angered, snapped that he was a mighty and dignified dragon. He was irritated by Pablo's reaction and told him that he would have to work under Lewis for 10 years. Pablo, taken aback, asked if the time really had to be 10 years. Lewis clarified that it would be at most 10 years, but it wouldn't be any less. Once Pablo completed his task, he would be free. Pablo then asked what kind of job it would be. Lewis replied that his job was to help bring them home for world peace. Pablo wondered what world peace had to do with bringing them home. Lewis replied that Pablo knew who he meant by them. Pablo hesitated and said it was the dragons and a hatchling. Lewis gave him a chilling look and confirmed he was right, then asked if Pablo had ever heard the story of a knave knight who killed a young hatchling and called himself a dragon slayer. The father dragon, who had lost his child, was blinded by rage and destroyed the entire kingdom in his fury. Pablo asked if that was the real story. Lewis replied that even monsters get angry when their babies were harmed. He asked if Pablo thought the dragons would simply stay still in such a situation, especially if the parents were two zero-class dragons who had reached ascension. The world would face an unprecedented catastrophe. Did Pablo understand that now? Pablo nodded in agreement but couldn't help wondering why such an important task was being entrusted to someone like him. Lewis, on the other hand, thought it was simply because Pablo was the first one to catch his eye and seem easy to handle. However, he told Pablo that he was the chosen one and then commented on his strong shoulders and robust physique. Lewis observed that Pablo looked so sturdy that he wouldn't break even if he were rolled around. He then mentioned Pablo's fearless spirit and the inaction to match, though in Lewis' opinion, anyone who dared to challenge him would likely disappear on their own. Even at a glance, he could see the loyalty overflowing from Pablo's entire being. And with dwarf blood running through his veins, there was no need to worry about betrayal. Lewis continued asking if he wasn't truly worthy of being chosen by a dragon. He thought of Pablo as the ultimate servant. He then pointed out that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him as well, because it wasn't just one hatchling, but three. If Pablo could at least bring those three safely home, did he really think their parents would let his efforts go unnoticed? There would be incredible rewards beyond his imagination waiting for him. Pablo was excited to hear this, and Luis asked if it gave him confidence to know that he had been chosen. Pablo eagerly agreed. Finn, watching the exchange, couldn't help but think that Luis was truly something else. Luis then asked if Pablo was ready to come with them without any regrets. Without hesitation, Pablo agreed. Suddenly, Luis created flares around Pablo, causing him to wonder what was happening. Confused, Pablo asked what it meant. Luis simply replied that he was putting on the leash himself. Pablo was even more puzzled by the meaning behind his words. Luis then explained, it was the so-called bond of blood, a rule imposed on their kind. Any promise made in front of a dragon had to be kept unconditionally. Pablo, now concerned, asked what would happen if the promise was broken. Luis casually replied that it wasn't anything too severe, but he wouldn't be able to carry on his lineage. Pablo was utterly shocked. Seeing his reaction, Luis asked why he was still so downhearted. As long as he kept his promise, there wouldn't be any problems. Still uneasy, Pablo asked if Luis was absolutely sure about that. Annoyed, Luis snapped, telling him that if he didn't trust him, he could go ask another dwarf. With that settled, Luis officially introduced Pablo as their lackey and temporary guardian. Pablo greeted them both respectfully. The two were excited to see such a giant dwarf. Neither of them had ever seen one so tall before. Curious, Luis then asked how Pablo had grown to be so tall. Since he was of mixed blood, he shouldn't have been this tall in the first place. Pablo agreed and explained that when he was young, he was actually smaller than his peers. He thought it was around the time he turned 20 when he happened to eat a strange fruit. Shortly after, he felt ill for 10 days. But when he woke up, he was noticeably stronger and much taller. Luis, intrigued, immediately asked what the fruit looked like. Pablo replied that it was a strange-looking fruit shaped like a bone. Curious, Luis stood up and searched through one of his books. After flipping through a few pages, he finally found an entry about it. He showed the illustration to Pablo and asked if it was the same fruit. Pablo looked at it carefully and confirmed that it was indeed the same. A thought crossed Luis's mind. If eating that fruit could make someone grow so much stronger and taller, then maybe he could use it to surpass those twins who always made fun of him for being smaller. Just as Pablo was about to leave, saying he would inform his subordinates about his departure, Luis suddenly stopped him. He told Pablo that returning home would have to wait. Their top priority right now was finding that grow fruit. Just then, the twins arrived and asked what the fruit was. Luis, thinking it was part of his plan, decided he wasn't going to tell them. Pablo, however, spoke up, saying there was a small problem. When Luis asked about the problem, Pablo explained that the area where the tree was located had been occupied by a group of snow orcs, making it difficult to approach. Luis, confused, told Pablo to stop with the nonsense and just guide them to the tree. He would take care of the rest. They all made their way to a cliff, where Pablo pointed out a small village below. Luis asked if the tree was there. Pablo confirmed, explaining that it was the orcs' campsite. It hadn't been that large when they first settled there, but over time, the orc numbers had grown to over 100. Luis then asked where the fruit was. Pablo hesitated before replying, saying the fruit was likely in the center of the orc camp. Luis, shocked, asked if the orcs had already destroyed the tree. Pablo reassured him, telling him not to worry. The tree's location was actually in an underground cave hidden from view. He had discovered it by chance, so the orcs would never find it. Luis was relieved to hear this and called out to the twins, telling them to get ready to start the mission. The three of them took the slide ride from the cliff to head down. Pablo suddenly asked them to wait, explaining that the snow orcs were several times stronger than regular orcs, so they needed to make a plan first. Finn interrupted, saying there was no need to worry. Despite how young the twins appeared, she was certain Pablo didn't see them as mere children. She pointed out that they should just watch and see why dragons were praised as the strongest beings on Earth and feared by all. As the three rushed to attack the orcs were terrified at the sight of them. The twins leaped into action, slashing with their swords, killing a few orcs, while the others fled. Khan wondered aloud where they were all running to. Finn told Pablo to pay attention to what was happening. Pablo, stunned, remarked that if dragons truly had unmatched power, then the snow orcs weren't the type to flee so easily. Finn explained that there was a saying about the red dragon, and the orcs were exactly like that. Even though they were violent snow orcs, the mere presence of a top predator in front of them made them want to submit. With their minds driven purely by instinct, did Pablo think the orcs could withstand the noble aura of a dragon? Pablo was left in shock, unable to fully grasp the power of what he was witnessing. Finn continued, explaining that the fear dragons exude causes creatures to lose all willpower, succumbing to fear just by facing it, something very human-like. They were still young, but if they went through their second molting and grew up, then simply facing that aura could overwhelm the snow orcs, leading to them being massacred by the swarm. Just then, a bandit approached, calling Pablo boss. Finn was holding the fur Pablo was wearing. The bandit asked Pablo if he was alright, noticing that the entire canyon was shaking. He saw that the orc campsite was being wiped out and wondered who was responsible. Pablo pointed toward the twins. Lewis, using his explosive attributes, attacked the orcs, while the twins unleashed a lightning whirl, slashing through the orcs. The bandit was shocked by the scene. Kids brought in worse slaughter than expected. He then asked if Pablo had known about this. Pablo confirmed that was what he had guessed. Finn, smiling, urged Pablo to tell the bandit. Pablo did, and the bandit, overjoyed, praised him, saying it was no surprise that their boss had recognized their true power. Talented people can always recognize each other, he said with a grin. Finn continued to watch the scene unfold while Pablo explained that he had asked the kids to deal with the snow orcs. The bandit, still shocked, asked that what's going on with those monsters. What kind of kids were they? Finn's temper flared, wondering how the bandit dared call them monsters. At the same time, Pablo grew angry and snapped, asking how the bandit could dare refer to them as such. Finn, exasperated, smacked Pablo and asked why he always copied everything. Pablo quickly apologized. The bandit called out to Pablo again, and Pablo explained that since they weren't just ordinary people, they shouldn't be treated carelessly. He reminded the bandit to take good care of them. The bandit was completely confused by Pablo's words. Just then, a giant orc appeared, charging at Lewis with a powerful swing. Lewis easily blocked it and countered with a heavy punch, sending the orc crashing back into the stones, where it was killed on impact. Lewis, uninterested, muttered that it was boring. The bandit stood in shock, amazed by Lewis's effortless display of strength. After defeating the other orcs, the twins took a break, with Khan commenting that it had been tough. Lewis praised their efforts and told them to rest for now. He mentioned he would be heading somewhere for a moment and asked them to take it easy in his absence. Lewis then looked at Pablo and the other bandit. He remarked that Pablo should be rushing to him, but wondered why he was still standing there. As Lewis turned to leave, he told the bandit to stay put, as he would go check something out. The bandit asked if he should accompany Lewis, but Pablo interrupted, asking if that was really necessary. The bandit declined, telling Pablo to go on ahead. Pablo walked up to Lewis and asked if Lewis had called him. Lewis asked where the grow fruit was, but Pablo didn't understand. Growing impatient, Lewis repeated, asking where the grow fruit was. Pablo, looking confused, led Lewis to the center of the village where the cave was located. He explained that if Lewis went through the entrance and walked a bit further, he would find it. Lewis asked Pablo to stay behind, saying the entrance was just ahead. Upon entering the cave and walking a little further, Lewis spotted a glowing tree. He was excited at first, thinking he had found what he was looking for. The grow fruit was there, and Lewis was ecstatic, imagining how his future height would grow. But as he approached, he realized the fruit was small, certainly not even half the size it was supposed to be according to the book. It was clear that the fruit's growth was incomplete, and it would take at least 200 more years to ripen fully. Lewis sighed in disappointment, thinking that if the fruit was immature, its effects would be significantly diminished. He wondered what he should do with it. He left the cave and found Pablo waiting for him outside. Pablo asked if Lewis had found what he was looking for. Lewis confirmed the tree was there but explained that the fruit wasn't fully ripe yet. Pablo asked what Lewis planned to do now. Lewis replied with frustration, saying that what else he could do, and he will have to wait until it's fully ripe before he can eat it. Pablo then asked what would happen if someone else stole the fruit. Lewis acted threateningly, telling Pablo to let anyone try. He created a barrier around the tree and even placed a sign warning that touching Lewis's things would be harmful. After that, Lewis turned to Pablo and asked about his subordinates, saying he was thinking of using them. Pablo wondered why Lewis wanted to use his underlings, but Lewis grew angry, asking why Pablo was questioning him. Pablo replied that Lewis could do whatever he wanted and use them however he pleased. Lewis thought about how he had set up traps and used every trick he knew, but he still felt uneasy. He needed someone to keep an eye on the grow fruit until it was fully ripe. Soon he found himself standing before Pablo's subordinates, all lined up in front of him on a rock. Lewis looked at them and turned to Pablo, asking how it was that none of them seemed decent enough for the task. He then thought about how it was worth investing time for his future growth and mentioned that they would need to finish this task with short-term measures for now. A bandit looked around in confusion, wondering what was going on and why everyone had gathered there. Another bandit shrugged, saying he had no idea either, and questioned whether a battle was about to break out. The first bandit, still referring to the kids as monsters, wondered why they were even there in the first place. Lewis then called out to the group, instructing them to listen. He had gathered them all to deliver important news. The bandit group was officially disbanded. Shocked, the bandits erupted in protest, demanding to know what he was talking about and who had given him the right to make such a decision. One of the bandits turned to Pablo, asking if he was really going along with this. Lewis, ignoring their protests, called for the twins to begin. The twins grabbed their sticks and advanced toward the bandits. Terrified, the bandits pleaded with him not to come any closer. But the twins paid no mind and started striking them indiscriminately, not even caring where their hits landed. Lewis watched with amusement, encouraging them. Aim for their heads. The bandits screamed in pain as they were beaten mercilessly. Meanwhile, Pablo stood by feeling sorry for them. By the end, the bandits were heavily injured, left groaning in pain, barely able to move. Lewis patted Khan on the head in approval, praising both twins for their work. Then, turning to the defeated bandits, he said that it was their reality. All of them weren't even handled two kids, but then with a smirk, he added to don't worry, and he will make sure to reshape them all. A squirrel was sitting on a tree branch eating something when someone shot at it, trying to hit its food. The squirrel quickly jumped from tree to escape. Lewis shouted at the person who shot, criticizing him for putting too much strain on his legs. He asked if his eyes were just for decoration, questioning why he couldn't avoid something so clearly visible. As Lewis scolded them, the others explained that the squirrel had been too fast and pleaded for mercy. Lewis told them they were all weak and granted them a 10-minute break. A fat man muttered that he felt like he was going to die and wished he could just faint. The second man agreed, saying it was the same for him, and at least those who fainted wouldn't get beaten. The first man wondered aloud if they should just leave. The second man cautioned him to remember the two men from the next room who had been caught running and had to do self-training for 2 days at night. The first man protested, saying they weren't even soldiers, so why should they be subjected to such training? The second man stood up and asked if he still thought it was worth living for. Even if he did, the second man had already given up on thinking about it. He suggested that they just clear their minds, endure the beatings, and the day would eventually pass. The first man started crying, lamenting that even though they were beaten daily, their bodies didn't seem to break down, yet they still felt fine. As the first man cried, Lewis watched over them, reflecting that they were growing stronger thanks to the finest potions his father made for their meals. The potions helped them recover their strength after resting. Lewis injected them with willpower during a mental training in their exercises to prevent laziness. He had also taught them martial law from the books his father had brought from the study room, ensuring that they improve every day. Though it was basic knowledge from the dragon's library, Lewis found it a bit wasteful to teach them, but it was necessary if he wanted them to develop quickly. He muttered that they were all incredibly lucky. Just then, Pablo approached and called out to him. Lewis asked how the task he had assigned to Pablo was going. Pablo hesitated for a moment before replying that he had finished. Lewis praised his work and told him to go ahead and prepare. He would join him soon. Lewis then said that the lion throws its cubs off cliffs to make them stronger. Pablo walked away, wondering what Lewis truly intended to do with all of this. After some time, the bandits gathered at a location, lifting bags and working together. They all wondered how the task was progressing and what their next steps would be. Another man wondered about the bags their boss had asked them to carry. Pablo arrived, asking them all to move aside. They were shocked to see that Pablo had brought a catapult with him. A man approached and asked if they were planning to siege somewhere. Lewis told everyone to listen up, noting that they were all probably curious as to why they had been called there. Instead of explaining it verbally, Lewis said it would be better if they saw it for themselves. He then called Cammy forward and told her to get in the catapult. Cammy eagerly climbed in, excited for what was about to happen. The bandits watched, shocked by the unusual setup. Lewis asked Cammy if she was ready, and she confirmed she was. Lewis signaled for her to be launched, and Cammy was flung into the sky, laughing joyfully. The bandits were stunned at what they had just witnessed. Pablo, observing, wondered if this was what Lewis meant by throwing the lion cubs off cliffs. As Cammy saw her, the bandits feared she would fall, but to their surprise, a parachute opened from the bag attached to her, leaving everyone in shock. Lewis explained that both the catapult and the parachute worked perfectly. He then told the bandits that they would all have to do the same thing. The group was terrified. Lewis looked at them confused and asked if they hadn't seen it properly. He wondered if he would need to demonstrate it again. For the next demonstration, Lewis called on Khan. Khan was thrown into the air just like Cammy, and he opened his parachute to land safely. Lewis observed that since the kids were light, they flew a bit further than where the grow fruit was. However, this distance was within the acceptable range, so everything was fine. This method would also allow him to mobilize them quickly before his potion was stolen. Lewis confidently told them it was easy. They just fly, whoosh, and then pop. The bandits trembled with fear, and one man, desperate, ran a little way and begged for help, saying he didn't want to die in such a place. Lewis quickly created a barrier, causing the man to hit it and fall back. The others watched in confusion as Lewis reassured them, saying that although it was scary, with a little courage, they would soon find it easy. Another man said they should just listen to their boss, though he couldn't believe anyone would do something as crazy as this. Lewis reiterated that they could do it. He suggested that perhaps if someone else demonstrated, they would understand better. As Lewis looked at Pablo, he saw that Pablo was just as scared as the others. Lewis approached Pablo, telling him that he could easily do it. Pablo replied that he didn't have the courage to try. Lewis addressed the others, saying that since no one had the courage, they would use the catapult to train Pablo. The group gathered around Pablo, thinking that everything they were going through was his fault. They believed Pablo had been living comfortably while they suffered, and when they thought about it, it was Pablo who had even brought the catapult in the first place. Pablo protested, asking them to let him go, but they kept pushing him, blaming him for everything. They were taking him to get ready, and he kept begging them to leave him alone, but they wouldn't listen. Finally, when Pablo was launched, Lewis, watching from a distance, realized that he had been worried because of Pablo's size, but surprisingly, he flew better than expected. Lewis turned to ask who was going to try next. The others were feeling depressed at the thought of having to do the same thing. Eventually, they were all launched one by one, though reluctantly. 4 weeks later, Lewis was sitting in a room reading a book, pondering whether his plan would work. Though the basic technique book was excellent, it was only the foundation. If skilled people showed up, they would easily steal the grow fruit from him. To prepare, he needed to teach them advanced techniques. The only advanced martial technique book he had was the Hero King's martial arts book. The problem was that the technique theory was so complex that even Lewis had trouble understanding it, and he didn't have enough time to master it himself. So he had to find a suitable advanced martial technique book. While wondering what to do, the door suddenly opened and Khan and Cammy entered, surprising him. Khan asked about the martial technique book, wondering if Lewis was learning it, but he didn't find it amusing. Lewis asked them if they had ever seen a martial arts book like that. They both replied, saying that there were many such books in their father's study room. Lewis then asked if they had memorized any martial arts books. Cammy replied that she had memorized 5, and Khan said he had memorized 10. The two began to argue, with Cammy claiming she knew 20 and Khan countering by saying he knew 100. Lewis thought that despite being dragons, they were still immature. However, there must be some useful and advanced martial books among the ones they had memorized. Instead of arguing, Lewis suggested that they both write down what they remembered so they could compare. Cammy asked why they needed to write it down, and Khan complained that writing was a hassle. Lewis noticed that they were both arguing about who had memorized more, so he suggested they write everything down and see who could write the most accurate ones. Excited by the challenge, they immediately got to work. As they wrote, Lewis thought to himself that it was just like little kids to get over things so quickly. Time passed, and later that same day, the twins returned, arguing about who had finished first. They were holding stacks of pages, and Lewis asked if they had already completed their task. He examined their work, thinking it wasn't just 1 or 2 books. They had written so much. He checked the pages and realized they had copied the contents of more than 11 martial books, and they had done it perfectly. Excitedly, they asked who won, and the argument started again over who had written down more books. Lewis calmly stated that it was a tie. The twins were confused and asked him to explain. Cammy claimed she had written more, with 6 books, while Khan argued that the martial techniques he wrote about were superior. Lewis once again insisted that it was a tie, which left them both disappointed. Just then, Finn came in, telling Lewis that she had completed the task he had given her, and that Pablo's work was almost finished as well. Lewis smiled and said she had completed it just in time. He then realized that he had found the advanced martial technique book he was looking for, and that it was time to leave. It was time to start preparing for the grand finale. 2 weeks later, all the bandits were standing at attention, saluting Lewis as one of them commanded them. Lewis addressed the group, expressing his satisfaction with their instructor and commending them all for their dedication. He praised their effort in sticking with the rigorous 6 weeks of training without any dropouts. He acknowledged how hard they had worked and perhaps how curious they all were about why they had to undergo such a hellish training process. Suddenly, a lightning bolt flashed from him, causing everyone to gasp in shock. As they looked, they saw a figure resembling a god holding a sword, leaving them wondering what was going on. The god introduced himself as Kalos, the god of war, stating that they had all been chosen by him. They were astonished to be selected by Kalos, a figure from ancient legends, the god of war who had battled chaos, creating demons with his sword and formed mountains from their corpses. The appearance of such a powerful being and his declaration of their selection filled them with awe. Meanwhile, Lewis was managing the illusion of Kalos, the god of war. He reflected that the illusion created using light refraction, reflection, and spatial techniques was working well. He noticed a slight imperfection and asked the twins to repair it. They quickly addressed the issue, the Khan promising to conceal it with a lightning effect. Lewis expressed his appreciation and considered expanding the illusion's space to touch the atmosphere with a power attribute. Kalos, the god of war, echoed Lewis's words, declaring that these people were chosen to prepare for a future disaster. They would become the light illuminating the encroaching darkness and the sword condemning evil. Lewis believed this was sufficient to deceive them. He then used a mental technique to engrave these words into their minds, completing the deception. The people felt transformed, readily believing in Kalos. Finn, sensing her cue, poured a potion onto a small plant, recalling Lewis's instruction that every drop of the growth accelerator would cause it to grow immensely. The onlookers were shocked by the sudden growth of the giant tree, proclaiming it a miracle. Carlos declared it proof of his promise to them. He then gestured towards a large rock, stating it would be a trial to prove their worth. Luis signaled Pablo, who shattered the rock with his giant hammer, revealing a cave. Carlos announced that those who passed the Cave of Trials would receive his blessings and rewards, eliciting cheers from the crowd. Luis knew that the cave contained martial technique books written by the twins, as well as carefully selected spiritual books. He also knew that navigating the cave would be challenging, due to the various traps set by Pablo. Carlos addressed the people as chosen warriors, promising that as long as the Tree of Promise thrived, he would return. He urged them to believe and wait, and then vanished. A man declared that they were the chosen beings and all the hardships they had faced were tests for their selection. This announcement filled them with excitement, as they now believed themselves to be the chosen ones. Luis observed their enthusiasm and thought it was the perfect finale. The twins and Finn applauded him, and the twins expressed their desire to repeat the performance, finding it enjoyable. Luis thanked them. Pablo watched their happiness along with the joy of his subordinates. He reflected that they now firmly believed they had been chosen by the god of war. The tree and the entire area would become a holy ground, and they would willingly risk their lives to protect it, becoming, in essence, guard dogs. Then he questioned his own role. If they were guard dogs, didn't that make him a dog being dragged on a leash? He knelt, disappointed with his perceived fate. Luis called out to him, asking what he was doing and reminding him that they were leaving. Pablo rose, and Luis, along with the twins, Pablo and Finn, departed. The twins asked where they were headed and suggested going to a more entertaining location. The scene shifted to Silver Flower Castle, where Jean was worried about Luis's well-being. He wondered if Luis was eating properly and believed that, regardless of the importance of the succession, Luis should not be left alone. He questioned his father's absence during such a crucial time, wishing his father had handled the matter instead. He then decided to let his concerns go. Despite the mountain of tasks he faced, he reasoned that sneaking away for a single day wouldn't cause any significant problems. Just as he made this decision, someone approached Jean, asking why he was in such a hurry. They playfully accused him of planning to run away, implying he was afraid of his duties. Jean wondered what the man was talking about and what he was doing there. The man was Carlos, the father of Khan and Cami. He said he was just watching. Jean asked if Carlos didn't have anything better to do and told him to stop bothering him and leave. Carlos glanced around and Jean asked why he wasn't leaving. Carlos looked at the orb, and after taking it, he mentioned that he came to entertain Jean since he might be bored. Jean replied that it wasn't him who was bored, but Carlos. Carlos looked at Luis's face in the orb and asked if Jean was worried about him again. As Jean became visibly sad, Carlos asked if Jean was planning to sneak off and see Luis. Jean turned away, saying he didn't understand what Carlos was talking about. Carlos laughed and said he knew that leaving without permission during the succession was prohibited. He wondered what would happen if Jean were caught. Jean asked what Carlos thought of the elders, as they would surely notice, and there was nothing he could do if he got caught. Carlos said that Jean was really hopeless and asked if he was truly so worried about Luis. Jean responded by asking if Carlos wasn't worried about his twins. Carlos replied that he wasn't worried, but Jean insisted on knowing why. Carlos explained that his kids liked Luis so much, he even told them that if they were ever bored, they should just go visit Luis. Luis was no ordinary dragon. In fact, he was better at taking care of things than Carlos himself. Jean asked if Carlos was bragging. Carlos responded that Jean was often overprotective of his son. He added that Luis wasn't just any hatchling. He was a remarkable child born with 4 attributes. If they looked at the way Luis thought and acted, he was almost like a holy dragon. There was no dragon in the world who could raise a child as easily as Jean had raised Luis. Jean was truly blessed. Jean replied that although that might be true, he was still worried. Carlos placed a hand on Jean's shoulder and told him to stop worrying about Luis and focus on the succession of the elders instead. Who knows, maybe Luis was enjoying his freedom without Jean around. Carlos also told Jean not to worry about the twins bothering Luis too much because he had already instructed them to listen to Luis. Jean remarked that the twins had the same personality as Carlos, and they would be quite a handful. Carlos laughed, saying that was exactly what he thought. It was obvious they would cause an accident, and if something happened, he told them not to handle it themselves, but to leave it to Luis. The twins might be able to manage things, but if it were Luis, he would handle everything smoothly. Jean was growing angrier with Carlos, and Carlos asked if that wasn't perfect for his training. Jean hit Carlos and shouted that he would surely crack his head open to see what was inside his mind. Carlos wondered what was wrong with him and suggested that Jean should save his attribute power. Meanwhile, Luis was walking with his party. The twins kept calling his name, and he shouted for them to stop. They both retorted with attitude, saying that if they didn't call him, he would ignore them. Luis sighed, understanding their reasoning, and asked them not to call them anymore. They rushed to hug him, and he asked for some space. They replied that they liked him so much. Louis couldn't help but wonder what he had done in the past to deserve such things. Just then, Pablo arrived with a carriage pulled by a muscular horse. Pablo said he had done as Louis requested. Louis moved his hand over the horse, appreciating Pablo's effort as the journey would now be more comfortable. He then asked about the closest port to the west. Pablo thought for a moment and said that it would be the closest. It was quite active with trade from the autumn continent, so it should be easy to find a ship there. Louis asked how long it would take to get there. Pablo replied that if they traveled using the carriage, it would take about half a year. However, considering the frequent snowstorms along the way, the journey would be slower, so Louis should estimate it would take around a year. Louis thought this was longer than he had anticipated, and if unforeseen circumstances arose, the journey could take even longer. He then asked if there was any way to get there faster. Pablo wondered aloud, mentioning that in the winter continent, where snow fell heavily, carriages pulled by horses were the fastest form of travel, and there was no way to shorten the time other than that. Louis thought to himself, wondering if being stuck on the winter continent with no chance of moving for an entire year was really the only option. It seemed troublesome. Pablo called Louis's name, hesitantly adding that he was wondering if it might be possible for Louis to contact the other dragons. Louis gave him a side-eye, and Pablo quickly apologized, saying he was sure Louis had already considered it. However, Pablo suggested that if Louis knew of any dragons on the continent, perhaps he could ask one of them to take him home. Louis considered this, realizing that there must be dragons hidden somewhere on the winter continent. If he could find one and ask, they might be able to give him a ride. But then he sighed and said there were no dragons he knew of. Pablo was confused and asked what he meant. Louis explained that there were no dragons he knew personally. He then turned to Finn and asked if she happened to know anyone. She replied that she didn't know much about other dragons. The twins piped up, saying they didn't know any dragons either. Louis commented dryly that he hadn't expected much from them. He thought to himself that if only they could find another dragon, they could significantly shorten their return journey, but the real problem was where on earth they would find one. He then called Pablo over and asked if he knew any legends about dragons. Pablo thought for a moment and said there were a few legends he knew, but they could stop by a city on their way west to gather more information. Louis smiled, pleased with the suggestion. That's great. Without any delay, let's leave, he said. The twins got excited at the prospect of going on a search for another dragon. As evening approached, the group continued traveling, and Pablo stopped at a location, telling Louis that it was getting darker and they still had a long way to the next city. He thought it would be better if they camped there for the night. Louis agreed, and they started a fire on the side and began frying their food. When the twins saw the food, they eagerly remarked that it looked delicious. Colin asked Pablo when it would be ready. Pablo replied that it would be done soon and that they should wait a little longer. After a while, he sprinkled salt on the food and handed it to the twins. They eagerly began eating, excited by how good it tasted. Pablo then gave some food to Louis. As Louis ate, he found it was incredibly good, and the meat was perfectly seasoned. Pablo thanked him for the compliment. Louis then asked Pablo to finish what he had been saying earlier about a dragon appearing at the cash tower. Pablo agreed and explained that he had heard from a hunter in the city they had passed earlier that about 20 years ago, a monster believed to be a dragon had appeared in their village. Suddenly, Louis hit him with a bone, shouting to don't say that so loudly as if anyone heard them, they will think they were friends with the dragon. He then placed his leg over Pablo's and asked if he wanted him to show what a real monster looks like. Pablo, frightened, immediately apologized. Louis said he had praised Pablo once, and now he thought Pablo was almost at his level, so he should just say it again. Pablo, a bit uncertain, explained that according to the hunter about 20 years ago, a noble creature resembling the mighty dragon was sighted in their village. Although it was the size of a house, its roar was so loud that the entire village was terrified. Louis wondered if, with such vague information, its credibility was a bit weak. It seemed no different from the rumors circulating for the past few weeks. Pablo agreed and added that the nearby lord had dispatched a large force to investigate and even hired mercenaries who specialized in handling large-scale magical beasts. Louis then asked what happened next. Pablo continued, saying that since there had been no news of the troops returning, it was assumed that they were all wiped out. There had also been continuous reports of missing people in the Cash Tower Mountain, and now it was said that hardly anyone dared to go there. Louis thought to himself that after a creature, presumably a dragon, had been sighted, a large force sent for investigation also went missing. It seemed so interesting, especially since they were heading west. There shouldn't be any issues with the schedule being extended, and considering the information Fabro had gathered, there must be something there. However, Louis wondered if it wasn't a dragon but another powerful monster capable of confronting a large force. It could be like throwing oneself into the den of lions. He wasn't sure if it was worth the risk. Just then, Louis sensed something approaching. Pablo, noticing his change in demeanor, asked what it was. Louis replied that someone was coming. Pablo grabbed his hammer, prepared for the worst, and asked if it was a monster. Louis quickly denied it, saying it was a person and only one at that. Pablo said he would handle it and approached the direction of the figure, calling out who there was and just show themselves. A voice responded, saying they didn't need to be so guarded. A man stepped forward, greeting them and introduced himself as Jacob Trugan. He explained that he was just passing by and had noticed the light, so he came to check it out. Louis felt like the name Jacob Trugan was familiar and he wondered where he had heard it before. Jacob asked if it wasn't too much trouble and if he could borrow some warmth for a bit. Pablo immediately declined, explaining that there were children present. Jacob looked at the twins and said that he understood if they felt uneasy with an outsider around them. He apologized for disturbing them so late and said he would be on his way. As Jacob began to leave, Pablo turned to Louis and remarked that he had sent Jacob away from the camp. Suddenly, Louis remembered the name Trugan and asked Pablo to bring Jacob back immediately. Pablo wondered what had happened all of a sudden. Louis and Pablo ran to find Jacob, with Louis thinking that if Jacob was the same Trugan he knew, he had to bring him back. Louis recalled Ravina, a genius druid who commanded the Phantom Beast, the Blazing Tiger as her summon, and the warrior who would defeat his father in the future. She also had Trugan as her last name. If Jacob was indeed an ancestor of Ravina, Louis couldn't just let him go like that. Pablo returned with Jacob and said he didn't seem like a bad person, so he could stay for a while. Jacob thanked him, saying that it was because of them that he was still alive. As he spoke, he noticed Louis was staring at him. He asked that what was wrong and if he had something on my face. Louis replied that seeing Jacob traveling alone in such a remote area made him think Jacob must possess great skill. Jacob laughed and said that while he was indeed alone, he wasn't really by himself. Louis, puzzled, wondered what Jacob meant. The twins were equally confused. Jacob, sensing their curiosity, used his power. Louis immediately understood it was a mind attribute power. It was faint, but there was definitely mana from the mind attribute. As they heard a sound in the distance, Pablo asked that what's going on. He was shocked when he saw the shadow of a creature. It was the six-winged blood bird. The bird descended with a loud cry. As Pablo was about to attack with the hammer, Jacob stopped him, saying it was fine. Pablo hesitated, unsure of what to do. Jacob explained that the child was a summon under his control, and its name was Minky. Pablo wondered about the name Minky, recalling that it was the six-winged blood bird. He had heard it was a fearsome creature that could rival even wyverns when fully grown. How then could Jacob have tamed such a beast? Jacob reassured him, saying Minky had been under his care since it was a hatchling and it was safe since it obeyed him so well. Pablo asked if Jacob was a druid. Jacob nodded, admitting that he was still inexperienced. Louis thought about a druid with the Truvan surname and wondered if Jacob could truly be a descendant of Ravina. Then he asked Jacob if he was married. Jacob replied that he hadn't tied the knot yet. Louis then asked if Jacob had any siblings or perhaps a cousin with the surname Truban. Jacob answered that he was an only child and both he and his father carried the surname Truban. Louis thought to himself that Jacob was likely an enemy of Jean, which might cause trouble in the future. Jacob then asked why Louis was asking all of a sudden. Louis replied that he was simply curious and felt that rather than killing Jacob, it would be better to understand more about him. He wondered if Jacob had any descendants. Suddenly, Jacob felt a chill. As they stood together, Pablo asked Jacob to come sit near the fire. Jacob thanked him and then noticed the twins approaching Minky. They remarked that they had never seen such a big bird before. Jacob warned them not to get too close as Minky might react if anyone other than its owner approached recklessly. However, Minky simply sat there, calm and unbothered, even allowing Khan to climb onto its fur. Cammy hugged Minky from the front, saying it was as fluffy as a duke's feather blanket. Jacob warned that it might still be dangerous. Louis gathered the twins and reminded them not to touch anyone's pets without permission. As Minky looked at Louis, it sensed the dragon within him. It stood up and Jacob quickly warned him to be cautious. But to Jacob's surprise, Minky lay down and acted like a small child. Louis played with it for a while, and Jacob was shocked by the display of Ajo, something Minky had never shown him before. The twins climbed onto Minky, exclaiming how warm and soft it was. Khan said he wanted to sleep on it that night. Jacob turned to Pablo and asked what kind of children they were. Pablo replied that they were his nephews. The next day, they packed up their things, and Jacob thanked Pablo for his hospitality. Pablo offered travel together, but Jacob wasn't sure how he could repay them for their kindness. Pablo reminded Louis how he had insisted on bringing Jacob along. He explained that since they were heading in the same direction, he thought it would be a good idea. Then he expressed curiosity about Minky. Jacob reassured him, saying not to worry, Minky would follow them on his own. Louis then called out, asking if they were ready to leave. Pablo agreed, and as they set off, Minky took flight to follow them. As they traveled, Louis asked Jacob where he was headed. Jacob replied that he was going to a mountain called Cash Tower in the west. Louis, curious, asked why he was going there. Jacob answered that something on the mountain would fulfill his dream. Louis wondered what could be found on Cash Tower Mountain that would fulfill Jacob's dream. Jacob explained that if Louis asked what his dream was, it was to tame a dragon. Louis didn't seem convinced by this. Jacob went on saying that dragons were the strongest creatures on Earth and the ultimate goal for every druid. If he could tame a dragon, there would be nothing to fear in the world. The dragon would fill his heart with grandeur. Pablo laughed and teased Jacob, asking if he was dreaming of something impossible and dangerous, and that he might end up dead. Jacob replied that it was precisely because it was a dream that he would keep striving, and one day he would surely tame a dragon with his own hands. Louis, though, thought he could kill Jacob right then and there. He didn't believe there was a dragon on Cash Tower Mountain, but he was certain that whatever creature was there, it wasn't a dragon. If it were a dragon, there was no way Jacob attempting to tame it would still be alive. If that were the case, Ravina wouldn't have been born in the first place. Louis then considered that the creature on Cash Tower Mountain was likely the Thunder Tiger. If Jacob really tamed the Thunder Tiger there, it would eventually evolve through generations into the Blazing Tiger that Ravina commands. But Louis couldn't let that happen. He needed to take action. Louis commented that Jacob's dream was quite amazing. Jacob thanked him, and Louis, with a hint of sincerity, said he hoped Jacob's dream would come true. Jacob, in return, promised he would take Louis for a ride someday. Pablo, feeling a bit sad for Louis, quietly offered his condolences in advance. They finally reached Cash Tower Mountain, and Jacob remarked that it was such a wonderful morning to meet a dragon. Louis, waking up, agreed, saying it was such a lovely morning that even dragons would wake up feeling refreshed. Jacob greeted him with a good morning and asked if he had slept well. Louis nodded and asked if Jacob had seen the twins. Jacob replied that he hadn't seen them and wondered if they had been sleeping together in the carriage. Pablo woke up and greeted them with a good morning. Louis then asked him if he had seen the twins. Pablo also denied it. Louis wondered where they had gone so early in the morning and what kind of trouble they might be getting into. Just then, Finn arrived, saying she had found the twins. Louis asked where they were. Finn hesitated before saying the twins had called her over. They were dragging a big monster. Kami explained that they had found a cat, but Khan asked if there was any cat that big, suggesting it was more likely a puppy. Louis, however, was shocked. It wasn't a cat or a puppy. It was the Thunder Tiger. Jacob recognized it as well. The twins then threw the creature down, excitedly calling it cute. They eagerly asked if they could keep it, insisting they were ready to take care of it. Louis, trying to stay calm, told them to hold on and asked where they had found it. The twins explained that they had been heading towards the mountain when the creature had come to them to play, so they had played with it. Louis thought that he had indeed been looking for the Thunder Tiger, but never expected to find it like this. Jacob, observing the creature closely, noted it was definitely a living Thunder Tiger cub. The twins quickly intervened, telling Jacob not to touch it, as it was their Nabi. Jacob was confused by the word Nabi, but Louis quickly realized that the twins had even given it a name. Then Louis noticed the tiger's eyes were open, and he approached it cautiously. He noticed its eyes were shaking and its breathing was irregular. Was it really fainting? Suddenly, Nabi jumped toward Louis, wanting to play. Louis, feeling threatened, instinctively punched it back, asking if it really growling at him. To his surprise, the Thunder Tiger started crying like a baby, which left Jacob stunned. He couldn't believe Louis had subdued the Thunder Tiger with a single punch. Pablo chuckled and explained that his nephews were a bit fearless. The twins then checked on Nabi to see if it was hurt. Jacob assured them that the steam rising from the cub was simply a sign of it being scared. Louis, though, thought to himself that no matter how young the tiger was, it was still a cub, and its mother wasn't around, which felt strange. His attention shifted, and he suddenly felt a powerful energy in the air. He wondered if it could be the mother of the Thunder Tiger nearby. Pablo and Jacob heard a sound and wondered what it was. Suddenly, a monster appeared, and when Jacob saw it, he froze in fear. "It's a drake," he whispered. Louis quickly silenced him, telling him to be quiet. He explained that if they moved now, they would attract the drake's attention, so they needed to remain hidden. Louis then used a special concealment spell to make them all invisible. Jacob immediately recognized it as spatial concealment, a magic technique powerful enough to cover such a large area in an instant. He marveled at how such a young child could wield such a skill. The drake was so close, and it couldn't notice them due to the invisibility spell. Jacob, still in awe, thought to himself that not only was the Thunder Tiger a rare sight in itself, but now they were facing a drake, an ancient creature that hadn't been discovered in hundreds of years. What was happening here? Was this the dragon rumored to exist on Cash Tower Mountain? Had it always been a drake, and there was never a dragon at all? What amazed Jacob even more was how quickly Louis had detected the drake's presence and instantly cast such a high-level spell. It was clear Louis possessed an extraordinary talent. Could such an ability really be explained by just the word genius? Jacob began to wonder who Louis really was. Suddenly, the drake let out a loud roar, shattering the silence. Louis was worried. Why was a drake here? He quickly asked Finn if there was any way to deal with it. She replied that a drake was a creature cultivated by the demon dragon Rodvarir using their own blood. Because it carried a small portion of dragon blood, it was immune to dragon fear. To fight it, they would need at least 3 or 4 Tier 1 fighters. Lewis thought to himself that if they fought now, their immediate annihilation seemed inevitable. He wondered why something that was supposed to be deep in the mountains had come down to this place. Was it searching for something? He speculated that it might be looking for the Thunder Tiger cub. Just then, the drake looked away as if sensing something, and it turned in that direction. Lewis thought that it seemed like the drake was giving up and heading back. However, the weather suddenly grew darker, and Lewis was shocked. A bolt of lightning struck, hitting the drake and even damaging Lewis's protective barrier. He quickly used a stone to shield them, but as he opened his eyes, he saw that the drake was now standing right in front of him, breaking through Lewis's spell. Without wasting any time, they all began to run, screaming in panic. The twins shouted that the drake was terrifying and was chasing them. Lewis snapped, telling them to shut up and keep running. Pablo urged them to run faster, warning that the drake would catch up soon. Jacob thought he could keep up with Pablo, but he wondered how the kids were running so fast. It felt like these three were anything but ordinary. As Jacob noticed the drake getting closer, he called out to Minky, ordering it to attack the drake. Lewis thought it was a good idea. Minky would be able to buy them some time. Finn then shouted that drakes had stiff joint structures and moved in a zigzag pattern, so they should do the same to slow it down. She suggested they head toward an area with lots of trees. Lewis quickly directed everyone to zigzag toward the mountain. As they ran, the drake launched flares toward Minky, knocking it down. Jacob was shocked and immediately turned back toward Minky. Lewis wondered what Jacob was thinking. He was running toward a drake that even a six-winged blood bird couldn't handle. They could all survive if they just made it to the mountain. Lewis followed Jacob, calling out that if they survived this, he would make sure Jacob could never have the kids. The twins were shocked but kept running ahead, and the Thunder Tiger cub, still trembling, followed them as well. Jacob knelt by Minky, trying to get it to stand up, but it was badly injured. The drake then bit down on Minky, and Jacob, enraged, summoned his power and struck the drake. The drake roared in anger, preparing to retaliate with its tail. Lewis quickly pulled back, telling everyone to get out of the way, just narrowly dodging the drake's attack. He then focused, making the spatial crystal rotate and shooting it directly at the drake. Jacob, still by Minky's side, urged the creature to get up, but it was too injured to move. The drake chewed through Lewis's spatial crystal, and Lewis was shocked. He wondered if it even made sense. How could the drake destroy it with just its mouth? In response, Lewis used a mental spell to make the drake feel disoriented, thinking that it would cause the creature to fall over. But to his surprise, the drake roared and shook off the effect, showing no signs of weakness. Lewis was taken aback. The mental spell had failed. Finn, observing the situation, explained that the drake's instincts were basic: hunger, mating, and fighting, and that mental spells wouldn't work on it due to its lack of intelligence. Lewis, frustrated, thought to himself, how dumb could it be? The drake let out a roar and charged at Lewis. At that moment, the twins rushed in with their swords to strike at the drake. However, they were immediately overwhelmed by the toughness of the creature's skin. The pain in their hands was intense, and they trembled as they tried to land a blow. Lewis noticed the drake flinching in pain from a lightning attack. He immediately seized the opportunity and called to the twins, "Keep attacking." The drake was vulnerable to lightning. Increase their lightning power and keep hitting it. They both delivered powerful attacks on the drake. Lewis thought it was impressive and speculated that its magic resistance hadn't protected its internal organs. He also realized he had underestimated their strength. Despite being young, they were dragons after all. He focused and used his unique power, channeling energy through his hands as he aimed to turn the creature into a lightning-grilled snack. Jacob was stunned by the display and wondered who these children were as they were facing off against a drake. Pablo remarked that his nephews were stronger than they appeared. Jacob questioned whether they were truly his nephews, to which Pablo warned him not to ask too many questions or he might regret it. Lewis launched another attack, injuring the drake further, and said they were almost there. The twins, exhausted and with aching arms, struggled to keep going. Lewis encouraged them to hold on just a bit longer. Just as he stopped, they heard another roar. Another drake had appeared. Lewis was taken aback. Cammy asked what they should do next. Lewis thought there was no choice but to reveal his true form, though he didn't want to do so in front of Jacob. He knew he had no other option but to transform and carry Pablo and Jacob away. As he prepared to speak to the twins, more roars echoed, and 2 thunder tigers attacked the second drake. The tiger cub was thrilled to see them. Jacob was stunned by the sight of 2 adult thunder tigers. Lewis smiled, explaining that when the cub was in danger, its parents had to come to the rescue. The twins were overjoyed to see the 2 large golden cats. As the first drake attempted to rise, Lewis swiftly ensnared it with chains, asking where it thought it was going. Despite its injury, the drake tried to get up. Lewis told the twins not to let it escape and promised they would end it once and for all. Lewis asked Pablo to join the attack as well. Pablo charged forward with his hammer to battle the first drake. As Pablo referred to Lewis as master, Jacob was puzzled and reminded himself that Pablo had mentioned those children were his nephews. He watched as one of the thunder tigers bit into the second drake. The drake retaliated, throwing the tiger away, but even injured, the tiger stood its ground, ready to fight. The drake roared loudly, causing the tiger to spit out blood, but it continued to fight. Just as the drake prepared to strike again, the second thunder tiger intervened, taking the blow for its companion. It was thrown into a tree, severely injured. This enraged the first tiger, which launched a fierce attack on the second drake. Its bite was so strong it seemed impossible for the drake to escape. The cub watched in silence, then noticed the first drake lying still on the ground. Lewis muttered that it was finally over. Khan and Cammy were resting, and Cammy commented that Shiva looked tired. Pablo informed them that the thunder tiger was heading towards them. The cub ran to its parent, but the young one then looked at Lewis. Lewis wondered if it recognized them. As the young tiger began to move forward, Lewis stopped it. The cub gave them a smile before leaping away, leaving them behind. The cub seemed emotional, as if saying goodbye. Finn remarked that the thunder tigers had risked their lives to protect their child, which made them true kings of the beasts. They saw a light ahead, and then Lewis turned to Cammy, telling her to take care of the children for a while. She asked where he was going. He replied that he was heading to the mountain. Concerned, she warned him it could be dangerous, but he reassured her he would return soon, so she didn't need to worry. Cammy agreed, urging him to be careful. Lewis looked at the cub tiger sitting nearby and asked if it wanted him to hop on. The cub agreed, and Lewis told it, "Let's go together." He climbed onto its back, amazed by its speed. He wondered how the twins managed to keep up with it. They came across the second drake, and to Lewis' shock, the bodies of the cub's parents lay there, lifeless. He realized the thunder tigers must have fought the drake to the death. The cub ran to one of its parents, licking them while crying. Lewis thought to himself that the cub had lost its parents just as he had in his past life. He reached out and gently patted the cub's head, offering some comfort in its grief. Lewis placed the bodies of the thunder tigers beneath the stones, contemplating how the Truven family had formed a bond with the thunder tigers. He realized that both the drakes and thunder tigers had nested on the same mountain, and they were bound to clash someday. Even without his intervention, their paths would have crossed, and they would have destroyed each other in the end. Jacob likely would have taken in the surviving thunder tiger cub, but since Lewis was there, he wouldn't let that happen. Using his power, Lewis connected with the cub, asking it to look at him. When the cub gazed at him, it felt terrified, realizing Lewis was a dragon. Lewis tried to reassure it, saying there was no reason to fear. If the cub trusted him, he would take it with him. He extended his hand, asking if the cub would follow him. The cub, though hesitant, placed its paw in Lewis' hand. Lewis smiled warmly at it. Pablo and the others soon arrived, and Cammy asked what Lewis was doing. Jacob explained that it was an obey skill, one that only high-level druids could cast. Despite being young, the thunder tiger was a supreme beast among supreme beasts, and it had completely responded to Lewis' spell. Jacob was about to comment that he now understood who Lewis really was. Lewis wondered if Jacob had figured out his true identity. Jacob then spoke, revealing that Lewis was a high elf. He shook Lewis' hand, expressing how honored he was to meet a guardian of the forest. He also asked if Lewis had been using a spell to hide his ears. Lewis was confused and replied that he thought there had been some misunderstanding. Judah, who overheard the conversation, thought it was perfect for him. He believed that if he let Jacob continue to misunderstand, Lewis' real identity would remain hidden. Lewis in turn agreed, stating that he was indeed the guardian of the forest, a high elf. Pablo, skeptical, wondered if this was some kind of scam. Jacob apologized for not recognizing Lewis earlier and asked for forgiveness for his past rudeness. Lewis kindly replied that it was fine, as such things happen sometimes. Khan, still curious, asked if elves usually spoke in such a way. Cammy, unsure, responded that she didn't know and that Lewis probably hadn't met an elf before. Jacob looked over at the twins, wondering if they were also elves. Lewis nodded and confirmed that the twins were his elf bodyguards. The twins, clearly annoyed, didn't appreciate the label. Pablo, however, thought it best to ignore the comments, as this wasn't the first time Lewis had said something like that. Lewis then turned to Jacob with a request to take care of the cub. Jacob was shocked, wondering if Lewis was asking him to care for the thunder tiger. The twins immediately protested, saying that the cub was theirs. Lewis, unfazed, ignored their objections and nodded at Pablo. Pablo sighed, reluctantly lifting the twins and taking them away from the scene. The twins were fuming, clearly angry at Lewis for making such a request. Lewis then asked Jacob that what did he say and could he take care of Nabi. Jacob replied that the cub had already formed a contract with Lewis. Lewis acknowledged this but explained that he was taking Nabi in out of pity, as he had no other choice. However, he was concerned about their perilous journey and whether Nabi could endure it. Jacob remarked that if even a high elf considered it a perilous journey, it must be serious. Lewis nodded, adding that based on his observations, Jacob seemed capable of taking good care of the cub. He reassured Jacob that he only needed to look after Nabi until Lewis returned to take him back. Jacob understood and promised to take care of the cub as if it were his own child. Lewis showed his trust in Jacob, thanking him. He then turned to the cub, asking it to follow Jacob. The cub seemed sad, so Lewis gently patted its head and explained that he couldn't take the cub with him right now. He told Nabi that if it listened to Jacob well, Lewis would come back for it one day. The cub agreed and walked over to Jacob. Jacob even called it by its name, Nabi, assuring the cub that he would take care of it. Lewis thought it had worked out well. Since the Thunder Tiger was bound by a contract with him, it wouldn't become an enemy in the future. He then told Jacob to feed Nabi light attribute stones. Jacob, puzzled, asked about the light attribute stones. Lewis explained that Nabi would grow one day and Jacob wouldn't regret it. As Jacob left with Nabi, Lewis watched them go. He thought to himself that it was a bit of trouble, but it had worked out in the end. While there had been no dragon involved, he had secured a future asset by bringing the Thunder Tiger to their side, which would ultimately benefit him. He then turned to the others and said to let's head west again. However, he soon noticed that the twins were angry with him. They told him they hated him for sending Nabi away on his own, and they wouldn't play with him anymore. Lewis, unfazed, pulled out an elixir and asked if they want some. Cammy asked for 2, while Khan asked for 3. Lewis and the others finally reached the port city of Lufthagen. As Khan looked around, he told Lewis that there were a lot of people around them. Cammy pointed at a lady with cat ears and mentioned that she was a beast folk, something Cammy hadn't seen before. Finn remarked that the place was on a completely different level compared to the villages they had passed, and that Lufthagen was teeming with all kinds of people. It was a bustling port city, active all year round as a hub for trade between the autumn continent and the winter continent. Lewis thought to himself that they had finally arrived. It had taken them half a year to travel from the Kashmir Mountains to Lufthagen, and they were only about halfway to their destination. He just wanted to go home quickly. The twins were excited, looking around and commenting on how there were so many interesting things. Lewis shouted at them, telling them to stop clinging to him and give him some space. They teased him more, and Pablo reminded him that they had reached their destination. Lewis stepped out of the carriage in front of the shelter of Siren and asked Pablo if this was the shabby inn he had mentioned as his favorite spot. Pablo replied that it had been 10 years since his last visit, so they should head inside first. As they entered, a lady welcomed them to the shelter of Siren by asking if they were there to stay or just to eat. Pablo replied that they were planning to stay, but before he could say more, she recognized him and asked if he was really Uncle Pablo. Pablo asked if she knew him. She introduced herself as Moana and asked if he had forgotten her. He wondered if she was the same tiny Moana he remembered. She replied that she wasn't tiny anymore and was now 24 years old. She then called out to Lucia, asking her to come and see who had arrived. Lucia came over, wondering why Moana was causing such a commotion. When she saw Pablo, she recognized him immediately. He was happy to see her and remarked how much she had grown, commenting that it seemed like she was ready to get married. Moana then asked about herself, to which Pablo replied that she had grown beautiful as well. Lewis got the feeling that Pablo was a regular at this place. Pablo then asked if Hammond and Julia had gone to the market. Lucia and Moana's expressions grew sad as they explained that their parents had passed away 3 years ago in an accident involving a runaway carriage. Pablo was shocked by the news and apologized for being so late. Lucia reassured him that it was fine, and Moana added that they had inherited the inn and were managing it well. Pablo placed his hands on their shoulders, commenting that they must have had a hard time. Lucia then asked about the children, wondering if they were Pablo's. Pablo paused and replied, asking her to wait, and how could they possibly be his children? They both asked if he was sure, and Moana even questioned where his conscience was. Pablo explained that those were his nephews. Lucia remarked that it still felt strange, and Moana asked if such beautiful kids could really be from his bloodline. Pablo replied that they were very distant relatives of his. Moana sat down in front of the twins, and as they acted cute, she hugged them, saying they were so adorable and wondering what she should do. The twins laughed, telling her they were being tickled. Lewis thought to himself that Moana should try raising those twins herself, and then she would understand how hard it was. Lucia then approached Lewis, introduced herself, and asked if he wasn't hungry. He looked away and admitted that he might be a little hungry. Moana and Lucia rushed to the kitchen, with Moana saying she would make something delicious and that they still had the meat they had brought earlier that day. Lucia agreed and said she would gather the ingredients. Lewis relaxed and muttered that being cute was exhausting. After the meal, Lewis lay down on the bed, sighing that it had been so long since he had eaten so much. He then turned to Pablo and said he hadn't had a chance to ask earlier about his relationship with the two sisters, since he seemed so close to them. Pablo replied that their parents had been his comrades in arms. Lewis asked if that meant they were mercenaries. Pablo nodded, explaining that they had been such funny friends, always bickering. One day, they fell in love with Moana and decided to give up their mercenary work to open the inn and raise their children. Because of that, Pablo had become a regular there. Lewis understood and then asked to leave. Pablo wondered why he suddenly wanted to go and where he intended to go. Lewis asked him where he thought they should go, saying they needed to finish the ship to take them to the autumn continent. He also requested some elixirs while they were at it. Pablo understood and asked if Lewis wanted to leave right away, considering they had just arrived. Lewis glared and Pablo turned to leave, saying he would get started immediately. Lewis even asked Finn to go with him, and Finn agreed to leave as well. Lewis looked over at the twins, who were sleeping peacefully, looking so relaxed. He thought to himself that they really did look like angels when they were asleep. Lewis stretched his body and said he should get some sleep as well. Moana arrived with some snacks, but she stopped at the door. Lucia noticed and asked why she wasn't going in. They both looked inside and saw Lewis sleeping with the twins on either side of him. Moana and Lucia stared at them, and Moana wondered how they could look so lovely even while sleeping. Lucia agreed, saying that all three of them looked adorable. Smiling, they quietly left the room, wishing them good night and a restful sleep. The next morning, the inn had already opened. Lewis came downstairs, yawning. When Lucia saw him, she asked if he had slept well. He nodded in agreement, and she pointed to where Pablo and the twins were sitting, telling him to go join them as she would bring breakfast soon. Lewis sat down and asked about the autumn continent. Pablo confirmed that the ship would depart in 2 weeks. Lewis expressed his appreciation for the work and then asked about the elixir. Pablo replied that it wasn't something easy to obtain, and he didn't expect it to be easy to find. Lewis thought to himself that only a dragon could stockpile such things. Ordinary humans would never even see an elixir in their lifetime. Human food might be fine for them, but it wouldn't help hatchlings like them. The sea route to the autumn continent would take about 2 months, so they needed to stock up before setting sail. Pablo reassured him not to worry too much, as they would surely be able to find what they needed. After all, this was Lufhagen, where all the supplies of the winter continent were gathered. Lewis said it was fine and suggested they check around the next day together. Moana brought a heavy chicken to the table, announcing that it would be their breakfast. Lucia was also there, encouraging them to take their time and enjoy the meal. Pablo wondered who could eat all that food in the morning. Moana replied that it wasn't for him, and Lucia asked the kids to give it a try. Pablo was about to eat, saying he wasn't refusing the food. After taking a bite, he mentioned that the taste was excellent and reminded him of the way their mother used to cook. Moana smiled and wonders whose daughter they thought she was. She then put her hand on Lucia's shoulder, adding that Lucia had helped too. Lucia quickly replied that she had only assisted Moana. Pablo then commented that now that he thought of it, Lucia was very good at singing. Lewis was intrigued and asked about it. Pablo explained that no one in Lufhagen could match Lucia's singing. Whenever she sang, the inn would always be packed with people, which was why they had named it the Shelter of Sirens. The crowds were so used to it that they would gather there whenever she performed. As Pablo continued talking, Lewis looked at the sisters and noticed they didn't seem to enjoy talking about those things. He gave Pablo a light hit. Pablo glanced at the sisters, but didn't look too pleased, and Moana commented that Lucia didn't sing anymore. Pablo was surprised and asked why she would waste such a great talent. Just as Moana was about to answer, a group of 4 men entered the inn. Lewis wondered who these rough-looking people were. Other customers nearby mentioned that these 4 never got tired of visiting and always came just for the inn's attraction. Lewis noticed that the 4 men were staring at Moana and Lucia. Pablo stood up and asked what everyone was doing, wondering if they even knew where they were. The 4 men stepped aside as a noble-looking boy entered, greeting Moana politely. He then turned to Lucia with shining eyes, kneeling in front of her and offering a bouquet. He called her my lady and complimented her, saying that she looked as beautiful as ever. Lewis thought to himself that it was all so cheesy, giving him goosebumps. Lucia took the bouquet and with a smile mentioned that she had already told him before. As she was about to say more, the boy stopped her, saying there was no need for further words. Just seeing her face that day had already calmed him, he claimed. He then bid her farewell, wishing her a peaceful rest of the day. As he walked away, their eyes met, and he gave Lewis a smile. Lewis felt a surge of annoyance, wondering if the boy was mocking him, possibly because of his height. Lewis then called out to Lucia, saying he was sleepy, and asked if she would just hold him. Lucia, slightly confused, wondered if she should hold him to help him sleep. He agreed, and Pablo looked on, even more puzzled by the situation. Lucia lifted Lewis, telling him they should go to his room and put him to bed. The noble boy didn't seem pleased by this, and watching them, Lewis wondered if the boy was getting jealous. The boy turned to leave, instructing the 4 men to follow him. Lewis thought to himself, who does this boy think he is, and couldn't help but stick his tongue out at him. Pablo then asked who the boy was. Moana mentioned that the boy was Carrie, eldest son of the Bunt family. Pablo wondered if she meant Tyrius Bunt the fighter. She agreed, adding that although he was once a fighter, he was now a baron. Pablo was shocked and asked if she was saying that Tyrius had become a baron. She confirmed, explaining that Baron Bunt had started with a Black Alley organization, which gained recognition by unifying the underworld of Lufhagen, stabilizing the port and earning the title from the local lord. Pablo remarked that Tyrrhius had always boasted that he would become a noble, and now he had. From what Pablo had seen earlier, Tyrrhius seemed really interested in Lucia, so he asked why Moana didn't encourage Lucia to pursue him. Moana told him not to bring it up. Pablo, still curious, wondered why Carrie was from a noble family and was so handsome. Moana explained that Carrie was only 14 and Lucia was 22. Pablo was surprised to hear that such a young boy looked like a man. With his spirit, they could marry right away. Moana shouted at him, and he quickly excused himself, saying it wasn't the right time to discuss things, and that he had to get going. Lewis was reading his book in bed while the twins were lying down. Pablo came in and told him that he had found all the shops that might sell the elixirs. Lewis closed his book and said to let's head out immediately. The twins asked where they were going and if they could join. Lewis replied that he was fine going out with Pablo, so they should stay and rest. The twins started acting like annoyed children, saying they didn't want to stay behind and wanted to go out with them. Just then, Moana and Lucia came in and asked where they were going. Lucia added that they surely weren't planning to venture into those dangerous places again. They had even brought new clothes for the twins to change into. After the three of them changed, Moana and Lucia complimented how good they looked. Moana placed a hand on Cammy's head, saying she was worried their clothes seemed too thin for the winter. That's why she had prepared these clothes so quickly, and she was glad they fit. Cammy thanked her. Moana told Pablo that there were no words for someone who dresses his nieces and nephews in such thin clothes in winter. Pablo responded that it wasn't like that. He believed the kids were like dragons, so there wouldn't be any problems. Lewis thanked her and said he would wear the clothes well. Lucia referred to him as the little prince and said it was nothing. Then Pablo and Lewis left, and the others waved to them. Moana assured them that they would take good care of the twins while they were out. Lucia wished them a good time. Lewis asked Pablo if he was sure they would find the elixirs. Pablo agreed, saying they could definitely count on him for that. Lewis responded to let's get going then. As evening fell, after hours of searching for the elixirs, Lewis sat down, clearly disappointed that not a single shop was selling them. Pablo reassured him that they would surely find it in Lufthagen. He apologized, saying he hadn't expected this either. Lewis, frustrated, muttered that it was really bad, and at this rate, Bozzy was going to be recorded as the first hatchling to die of malnutrition. Just then, they overheard an argument between two groups. Pablo wondered if they were fighting, and then he spotted Carrie among them. Lewis agreed, wondering why Carrie was there. One of the men from the other group told Carrie to give up on Lucia, asking why someone like her would pay attention to a bad boy like him. Perhaps it was because Carrie was a manly man like the speaker himself. His group agreed, saying it was too much for a kid like Carrie. Carrie's 4 men drew their swords, angered by the insult. One of them asked if the other group realized who they were insulting with such reckless words. The leader of the second group asked if Carrie was considering declaring war against the Daemon Gang. At that, all of the men from his group drew their swords as well. The situation was tense, and Carrie asked if they were out of their minds. He warned them that they wouldn't get away with it once his father found out. The man mocked Carrie, asking who would know and saying that he was just a lowly man. He then asked if Carrie wanted to teach him a lesson personally. Pablo and Luis approached, asking them to stop. Pablo said that while he didn't know what was going on, swinging swords around in broad daylight on the streets was a bit too much. Carrie wondered who they were, then recognized them from earlier at the Siren's shelter. The man dismissed them, saying they were just passing by and telling them to mind their own business and go on their way. Pablo, now a little offended, remarked that he knew it had been 10 years since he left, but surely there was someone who remembered him around here. One of the men suddenly seemed shocked and asked that if he was Blood Axe Pablo. Pablo, surprised, asked if anyone still remembered him. Carrie, confused, asked who Pablo was. The man explained that Carrie must have heard of him from the Baron. Pablo was the one who saved the Baron's life. Back when the Baron was still unifying the underworld before receiving his title, he fell into a trap set by opposing factions. At that very moment when the Baron's life was in danger, Pablo charged into enemy lines armed with nothing but an axe. Although he was stabbed 8 times, he managed to save the Baron. Carrie was stunned to learn that Pablo had been the one to save his father's life. He immediately shook Pablo's hand, saying that it was an honor to meet him there, and he had heard so much about Pablo from his father. Pablo downplayed it, saying it was all just stories from his father's mouth and wasn't such a big deal. Lewis, watching the interaction, thought that Pablo seemed like he was trying to show off a bit. The leader of the group, the bad guy, said that he was also honored to meet such a legendary figure. He introduced himself as Damon and mentioned that he was running a modest organization in Lufthagen. Lewis could sense a strange aura from Damon, which bothered him somehow. Damon bowed to show respect to Pablo, telling him that since he knew Carrie, they would be taking their leave and wished them a good day. Pablo wondered what was going on. It all felt so anticlimactic. He thought, what a strange fellow. Lewis wasn't entirely sure, but his intuition told him that Damon was going to cause some serious trouble soon. The scene shifts to the Bunt family residence where Pablo and Luis meet Pablo's old friend Tyrius, the father of Carrie. Tyrius hugs Pablo, exclaiming how many years it has been. Pablo responds, saying it's been over 10 years. Tyrius calls Pablo a heartless man and tells him he should have kept in touch more often. Pablo apologizes, explaining that life had been difficult, which was why he couldn't keep in contact. He adds that he never would have imagined that the fighter Tyrius would become so successful. Life really was full of surprises. Tyrius replies that it's all thanks to Pablo. If Pablo hadn't saved him back then, Tyrius wouldn't be standing in front of him now. Pablo brushes it off, telling Tyrius he's just flattering him. As Luis looks at Pablo, Pablo gets to the point of why they were there. But just as he's about to speak, Tyrius stops him, saying he's already heard it all from his son. Tyrius explains that they were looking for elixirs and he has already sent his men to find them. They shouldn't worry. He will make sure they have as much as they need in a few days. Luis, however, raises a concern. Based on what he saw earlier, it seems like they have problems with another organization. He asks if there will be any trouble in getting the elixir. Tyrius, curious, asks who Luis is. Pablo introduces him as his nephew and adds that, as Tyrius can see, Luis was a bit spoiled. He hopes Tyrius will understand. Tyrius agrees and explains that the Daemon faction has been causing trouble lately. Pablo comments that even underground thugs wouldn't dare mess with a noble, so he wonders what happened. Tyrius explains that recently there have been unexplained accidents causing the ships of the trading company protected by the Bunt family to run aground. Some people might call it bad luck, but rumors have spread that the grounded ships were attacked by monsters. This has led some to question the Bunt family's protection. Given the situation, Daemon had taken the opportunity to openly rebel against Tyrius. Pablo asks why Tyrius hasn't asked the Lord for help since the Lord was the one who granted him the barony. Tyrius replies that the Lord seems indifferent. He just lets things be as long as Lufthagen runs smoothly. Tyrius knows the Lord comes from the underground himself, which was why you won't care much even if Daemon makes a move. Pablo sighs, saying it's a real headache. Tyrius steps closer and says it's been a while since they last met, so that he shouldn't focus on gloomy matters. He insists that he will treat Pablo properly, and they should have a good time. Pablo, relieved, agrees, saying it sounds great and suggesting they stay up all night. Then he looks at Luis and tells Tyrius they can play but hesitates. Luis told Pablo not to look at him and to just have fun, thinking that Tyrius was going to give them the elixir for free. After all, he should at least let them enjoy it. Pablo was pleased and quickly responded to let's go quickly, and they drank until they dropped that night. Tyrius appreciated it as well. Then he told Carrie to make sure to take good care of Luis. Luis and Carrie exchanged glances. Luis thought to himself that he had to play with this kid, but they were years apart. Carrie then asked Luis to follow him, and Luis asked where were they going. Carrie replied that his father asked him to entertain Luis, so he was taking him to his room. Luis, intrigued, asked to show him the way and how a noble could entertain him. Carrie seemed annoyed by the question, but led Luis to his room, telling him to sit quietly anywhere and not touch anything. Luis, despite the warning, touched a night figure. As soon as Carrie saw this, he snatched it back and told Luis not to touch it or it would break. Luis teased, even though the act all grown up, he was still fond of this toy. Carrie retorted that it was none of Luis's business, adding that the night figure was a limited edition and could break if Luis handled it roughly. Luis then spotted a letter and began to read it. It was addressed to Lady Lucia, with the necklace described as capturing the brilliance of her eyes. Just as Luis was about to continue reading, Carrie rushed over to stop him, telling him not to read other people's letters. Luis paused, holding a box, and asked if it was the necklace. He opened the box to reveal a crystal that was shining brightly. Carrie quickly snatched it back from Luis. Luis remarked that while Carrie's letter-writing skills seemed childish, he had picked out a nice necklace, one that would really suit Lucia. Carrie, relieved, said it was a relief to hear that and explained that it had been hard to find. Luis commented that although the necklace looked expensive, it wasn't that difficult to find a necklace like that. Carrie explained that it was different because it was the famous Siren's Tear. Luis nodded, confirming it was the Siren's Tear, but then he was taken aback. He asked, "Is that the real one, not the fake one?" Carrie confirmed that it was the real Siren's Tear and that it had been verified by an official appraiser. Luis wondered aloud how such an item had ended up here. He recalled the original legend, which said the ruler of the sea, who cherished his daughter more than anyone, collected the last tears of his daughter and placed them into a jewel, thus creating the Siren's Tear. Most importantly, the Siren's Tear was said to be the key to the Sea Emperor's underwater labyrinth. Luis knew that the Sea Emperor's underwater labyrinth was crucial for the protagonist in the original story to level up, and he needed to get the Siren's Tear before anyone else did. He then tried to act cute, but it came off a bit strange, and he asked if Carrie give it to him. Carrie looked confused and asked if Luis was hurt anywhere. Luis continued to act cute, asking, "Just give it to me." Carrie, uncomfortable, wondered what was wrong with Luis. He found it creepy and told him to get away. As Lewis moved closer, Carrie reiterated that it was really creepy. Carrie told him not to ever dream about it, as the gift was meant for Lucia. Lewis looked away upon hearing that and asked what he would do if Lucia didn't accept the gift. Carrie replied that she wouldn't decline it, adding that, as the escort had said, women often fall for expensive gifts. Lewis responded that some women might, but from what he knew about Lucia, she didn't seem like someone who would accept a gift just because it was expensive. Carrie wondered if that was really the case. Lewis told her it wouldn't work, then suggested they sit down, and that he would teach her what real romance was. As Lewis explained, Carrie listened attentively, remarking that first and foremost, establishing a sense of closeness with the other person was important, and only then could feelings be gradually expressed. Lewis nodded while eating something and agreed, adding that sudden confessions, extravagant gifts, and overbearing approaches would only have the opposite effect. Carrie was annoyed. His advice was the complete opposite of everything he had been doing. Lewis sighed and remarked that he should have chosen the right person to seek relationship advice from in the first place. He then asked why he liked Lucia so much and whether there was something specific that triggered his feelings. Carrie replied that the first time he met her was 5 years ago, when Shiva was singing at the Siren Inn. It felt as though his dark future suddenly turned as bright as day. Her gestures, her beautiful smile, and her voice captivated him instantly. Lewis told him that was quite a long-winded explanation for falling in love with someone singing. Carrie clarified that it wasn't just the singing. The voice of Lucia was like a symphony of harmony if he had to describe it. Lewis asked if she sang so well, why she didn't sing anymore. Carrie explained that about 4 years ago, Lucia's favorite singer was performing and Lucia begged her parents to take her to see it. Unable to resist her excitement, her parents finally agreed, leaving Moana behind to take Lucia to the performance. On the way to the venue, however, the horses pulling the cart became frantic and crushed the people nearby. Lucia was injured in the accident, and when she woke up, she searched for her parents, but they were already dead. Carrie told Lewis that a carriage had crashed into them, killing both of them instantly. Afterward, Lucia was so traumatized by the accident that she could never bring herself to sing again. Lewis said that this was why Lucia believed her parents loved her because of her singing, and now that her voice wouldn't come out, he wondered if there was something he could do to help her and also earn the siren's tear. He then asked Carrie if he was truly planning to give the siren's tear to Lucia, given her tragic backstory, and whether he had lost his mind. It was like giving the siren's tear to a siren who couldn't sing. If Lucia received such a gift, wouldn't it only bring back the painful memories she tried to forget? Carrie asked if that was for real, admitting she hadn't thought of it that way. Lewis sighed, saying there was no end to what he had to teach Carrie from start to finish. He then proposed something to her and asked if she wanted to hear it. That night, Lewis returned to the inn and saw Moana cleaning the tables as she prepared to close the restaurant. She asked where Pablo was and why Vahi had come back alone. Lewis replied that Pablo had said he would be drinking with Tyrius. Moana remarked that Pablo was something else, sending a kid home so late. Lewis reassured her that Pablo was fine and wondered where Lucia was. Moana told him that Lucia was in her room and that he should just go upstairs. Lewis thanked her and headed upstairs. Moana added that if he was hungry, he should let her know, and she would bring him a snack. Lewis wondered if he should begin now. He recalled his conversation with Carrie, where she had agreed that if he could get Lucia to sing again, she would give him the siren's tear. Carrie had thought it was ridiculous, but Lewis was determined. He asked Carrie if he didn't say that he wanted to see Lucia sing again. Carrie hesitated but agreed. Lewis then pressed further, asking if he was to understand that the necklace meant more to her than Lucia. Carrie quickly clarified that it wasn't like that. She added that if Lucia could sing again, she would certainly give the necklace to anyone, even Lewis. Lewis then said that if it was a deal, then he would succeed and Carrie would give him the necklace. Carrie didn't seem entirely convinced, so Lewis asked that was it really all he was going to do for her, and he talked like he would give up the world for her. But it sounds like nothing more than childish talk. Carrie accepted the challenge, agreeing that if Lewis succeeded, he would be rewarded with the siren's tear. They sealed the deal with a handshake. Carrie told him to keep his word and never take it back. Lewis stopped, reminded of the weight of his promise, and knocked on Lucia's door. She opened it, asking that when did he get back. Lewis told her he was bored and asked if she would play with him. Lucia agreed, noting that he really did seem bored, and invited him inside her room. As he entered, Lewis looked around and was impressed by the beauty of the room. She thanked him for the compliment, saying she hadn't done much decorating but was glad he liked it. Lewis noticed a musical instrument and asked about it. Lucia explained that it was called a bomb, a traditional instrument used to play music. Upon hearing this, Lewis acted a little childish and asked if she would play it for him. Hesitant at first, Lucia smiled and agreed, asking if he really wanted to hear it. She sat down to play, and Lewis was mesmerized by how beautiful it sounded. The pure tones of the bomb filled the room, and Lewis thought to himself that no wonder Carrie was so smitten with her. When Lucia finished, Lewis clapped for her. She mentioned that it didn't go as well as she had hoped, since it had been a while since she last played. Lewis, surprised, told her it was an amazing performance. Lucia asked if he was serious, and hearing his praise, she felt a sense of relief. Lewis mentioned that he wanted to try playing it as well. Lucia raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was serious. He replied that he wanted to learn how to create beautiful sounds like she did. She was still skeptical but agreed, asking him to wait for a moment. She opened her wardrobe to search for something. After a moment, she returned with a small bomb and handed it to him as a gift. She explained that it was the one she used to play with when she was a child, and it was just the right size for him now. Lewis thanked her for the thoughtful gift and promised to take good care of it. She reached out and gently ruffled his hair, telling him that it was already late and they should start practicing the next day. He agreed and left, wishing her a good night. She wished him the same, telling him to sleep well. Lewis returned to his room, eager to try out the instrument. Finn, noticing his determination, remarked that Lewis planned to help Lucia forget her past trauma by giving her positive experiences with music. Lewis agreed, though he felt a bit strange about it. He wondered if it would be faster to just use some mental music to alter her memories. Lewis reflected that while quick fixes, like using shortcuts, might offer temporary relief, the pain would inevitably resurface. He believed kindness should be met with kindness and malice with malice. That was the rule he lived by. Since Lucia had been kind to them, he felt they should return the favor. Finn nodded in agreement, noting that they likely wouldn't be sticking to their original plan, but assured Lewis it would all work out. Lewis was still practicing the bomb at dawn, determined to improve. 3 days later, Lewis played for Lucia and asked that what do he think and if it was better now. Lucia smiled and replied that he really did well, and then he picked up the larger bomb, wondering if he should try playing it too. Lucia was amazed. Lewis was truly a prodigy. In just 1 day, he had mastered the grip technique, and by the second day, he had memorized all the chords. Lewis was now effortlessly playing a piece that even adults struggled with, and Lucia couldn't help but wonder where he had come from. He then asked her to teach him the song. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Damon, who was looking at a pamphlet mentioning the Full Catch Festival. It noted that participants were invited to join the Night of Chain Festival. Damon realized it was a singing event. A man nearby explained to Damon that it was one of the events of the Full Catch Festival held annually around this time. Contestants who applied competed in a singing contest for a prize. It was one of the most popular events of the festival, and he had heard that people were already practicing hard to win the prize this year as well. Damon smirked and remarked that it was perfect. A man asked what he meant by that. Damon replied that the more people gather, the louder the screams will be. The next morning, Pablo walked down the street, feeling as if he were dying. He thought he was getting old and never imagined that just a few days of drinking could be so difficult. As he walked, he heard the sound of singing from a nearby barn and wondered if it was Lucia, wondering if she had finally decided to sing again. But as he got closer, he saw that it was Lewis playing, and he wondered if Pablo had arrived at just the right time. Lewis noticed him and asked if Pablo had really come at this hour. Pablo smiled and sat down, explaining that Terrius wouldn't let him leave. Then Pablo asked about the barn, as he had never seen Lewis play an instrument before. Lewis replied that Lucia had given it to him. Pablo, remembering what he had heard earlier, commented that Lewis was no ordinary player and asked when he had started. Lewis replied that he began when he arrived. Pablo was shocked and asked if Lewis was saying he had been playing for less than a week and was already this good. Lewis simply said he tried and worked hard at it. Pablo felt a little irritated but didn't comment. Lewis then said that it was fine if Pablo had been drinking, but what about the task Lewis had given him? Pablo reassured him that he was working on it, clearing out every elixir left in the Luthagen. Thanks to Tyrius spreading the word, Pablo had already collected around 20 lower grade elixirs. Lewis didn't seem pleased by this, especially at the small number and low quality of the elixirs. Pablo defended himself, saying it was difficult to gather them, and recently finding elixirs in that area was as hard as picking stars from the sky. Lewis thought for a moment and, despite their rarity, pointed out that in a port city with so much trade, elixirs should be more readily available. He wondered aloud if someone else was raising or researching magical beasts. Pablo denied this, saying he didn't know of anyone, but asked why Lewis was asking. Lewis replied that it seemed like someone had been buying up large quantities of elixirs before he could get his hands on them. He reminded Pablo that elixirs were typically used to enhance human attributes or to feed magical beasts. For humans, there wasn't much need to buy them in bulk, since there was a limit to how much one person could consume at a time. However, if someone were raising magical beasts, they would need a steady supply of elixirs in large quantities. Pablo thought about it and said that if someone in the city was raising magical beasts, there was no way Tyrius wouldn't know about it. Lewis agreed, mentioning that it was strange that someone would go to such lengths to raise magical beasts without the Baron's knowledge. Lewis then asked Pablo if he thought he could figure out who had been buying the elixirs recently. Pablo replied that it would take some time, but if he asked Tyrius, it wouldn't be so difficult. Lewis instructed him to track down the final destination of all the elixirs from those people. Once he found it, he should take Finn and thoroughly search the place. Pablo agreed to do it, but asked why they needed to go through all this trouble. Louis replied that he wasn't sure yet, but he was starting to think Damon might be far crazier than he originally thought. Pablo stood up and said he would head off to get some sleep. Louis asked where he thought he was going. Confused, Pablo asked what Louis meant. Louis told him to stop thinking about it and just go out to do the work. Pablo explained that he had just come back and still had a hangover. Louis, seeming amused, stated that he had cut Pablo some slack, but now he thought Pablo believed he could slack off. He suggested they relive some old memories. Pablo reluctantly agreed and left the place. As he stepped outside, he noticed a party going on, and Louis, seeing the crowd, asked who they were. Pablo replied that the Full Catch Festival was starting soon. These days, the city was famous for trade, but it used to be a small fishing village. Back in the day, they held the Full Catch Festival every year to pray for the safety of the departing fishermen and for a bountiful catch. Over time, the tradition had turned into a grand festival. The highlight of the festival was the Night of Cain. Louis asked about the Night of Cain. Pablo explained that it was a singing contest where the best singers in the city competed for a prize, and it was quite a sight to behold. Lucia used to win first place every time she participated. As Pablo headed out, Louis stopped him, saying there was one more thing he had to do, and then he signed him up for the Night of Cain. Lucia was sitting in her room, watching the dawn break when Louis knocked on her door. She asked if he had been practicing the song she taught him. He confirmed, mentioning that he had a favorite ask. Lucia wondered what it was. Louis asked if she would take him to the festival he had heard would be held. The twins overheard the conversation and asked to join as well, saying they would have fun with him there. Lucia wondered if Louis really wanted to go to the festival, especially with all the noise and activity around lately. It was only natural to be curious. However, the problem was that, due to the festival season, the inn was already full of tourists, making it hard to leave. Just then, Moana entered, announcing that they were all going to the festival. She patted Louis' head and said that since the kids wanted to go, they'd take them for sure. Lucia asked if Moana was serious and what about the inn. Moana replied that it would only be for one day and that the inn wouldn't go bankrupt just by closing for a day. Besides, the real crowd hadn't even arrived yet, so they could enjoy themselves for the day and work hard the next day. Lucia agreed and said they should get ready to head out. Moana was thrilled about it. Cammy wondered if there would be lots of yummy food. Lucia smiled and promised she would buy them plenty of delicious treats. Cammy excitedly said it was going to be fun. Louis, watching the scene unfold, thought it was good that everything was going according to plan. It was time to move on to the next step. That night, Finn, dressed in her detective outfit, was scouting around the area. She rushed inside a container, wondering if it was the warehouse Pablo had mentioned. She recalled Pablo telling her that merchants usually traded elixirs at the warehouse on the western end of the port. While she wasn't sure what Louis was looking for, she knew she had to investigate the building. She reminded herself to press on, determined to uncover whatever was hidden there. Finn climbed to the upper open window of the warehouse and saw two men playing cards. She crouched down to hide and watched them closely. One of the men complained that he was bored and wondered how much longer they had to stay in the damp warehouse. The second man told him to stop complaining and just play his cards, as the boss had said he would contact them before the festival ended. Suddenly, they heard a noise, and Finn, curious, guessed it might be a beast. The first man grumbled that it had gone quiet again, while the second man said he fetched it last time, so it was his turn now. The first man went to check the container, muttering about how much the beast needed to eat before it was satisfied. Finn quickly caused a few rats to scurry across the floor, and when one of them hit the man's leg, he stumbled, causing the container to topple. Green contents spilled out from the container. The second man grew angry, shouting that he couldn't even live properly with this mess. The first man was equally upset. Finn thought the contents looked like elixirs and wondered if all the crates in the warehouse were filled with them. This couldn't be good, and she needed to figure out what the men were planning to do with them. She decided to sneak inside the container. The first man shouted about how the rat was the second man's fault and grumbled about having to clean up the warehouse. The first man rushed downstairs, grumbling that the second man acted all high and mighty, but he was just as stuck there as he was. Finn wondered where the stairs led and what was in the basement. The men placed the container down, and after hearing another noise, the second man stepped away. Finn poked her head out and, to her shock, saw a beast standing in front of her. The scene then shifted to the festival, where people were wearing beast costumes, enjoying the celebrations. The twins were having a blast. Moana remarked that the Full Catch Festival was truly deserving of its title as the best festival on the winter continent. Louis thought the festival was impressive. He had never seen such a large celebration in his past life, and it might even rival the grandeur of a parade. Lucia handed him something skewered on a stick to eat. Louis asked what it was, and she explained that it was called the frozen fruit, a special treat only available during the festival. She thought he should try it. When he did, he was delighted by the taste, which reminded him of the candy fruit he had eaten in his previous life. Lucia asked how it was and wondered if he had ever tasted anything like that before. He mentioned that it was incredibly delicious, and then, in the background, he heard the sound of music coming from a nearby barn. Someone must have been playing. Lucia explained that the preliminaries for the Night of Cain were taking place. Excited, Lewis grabbed her hand and suggested they go check it out and have fun. Lucia agreed, and they went together. As they arrived, they saw a man singing, but Lewis was confused. Why were they all so bad? Lucia explained that it was only the preliminaries and that the real talent would show up in the finals. Lewis, eager to see something better, suggested that she could sing far better than them. Lucia seemed hesitant, but Lewis couldn't take it and insisted they leave to find a better performance. Surprised, she followed him, wondering where he was taking her in such a hurry. They reached a man who asked who they were and informed them that they needed to sign up in advance to participate in the event. Lewis told him they were signed up under the names Lewis and Lucia, and if the man checked the list, he'd find their names. The man's eyes widened in shock, and he asked, "Is this the siren, Lucia?" The others around them were equally surprised to see Lucia there. They murmured in disbelief that she was no longer able to sing after that horrific incident. Lucia was about to leave, feeling uneasy, but Lewis stopped her and reassured her not to worry. He would sing, and she just needed to feel the music through the instrument. Lucia was taken aback by his confidence. He handed her the instrument, and all eyes were on them. As she hesitated, the man asked if she wasn't ready and if she needed more time so they could move on to the next participant. Just then, Lewis stepped onto the stage, greeting everyone as he emerged from the siren's shelter. They had all been so patient enduring the subpar performances up until that point. But now Lewis was about to introduce them to his accompanist, Lucia. When she appeared on stage, the crowd went wild, applauding her. She felt a little strange and told him that she didn't think she'd be able to do it. He asked her to give him her hands, and as she did, he used a calming technique, reassuring her that everything would be fine and that she would perform beautifully. Holding his hand, she felt a sense of calm and wondered about the strange feelings. He repeated that everything would be fine, so she didn't have to worry. She smiled, thanking him, and said that even though it was just words, they meant a lot to her. The man brought a chair for her to sit, and she asked Lewis what he was going to sing so she could adjust the instrument accordingly. Lewis addressed the audience, thanking them for waiting, and announced that he would sing for them. The crowd was initially disappointed because the boy was singing, not Lucia. A lady sitting next to him remarked that although the boy was cute, she wondered what kind of song a child could possibly sing. As Lewis began to sing, the audience was captivated by his beautiful voice. The lady beside him said she had never heard such a pure and clear voice in her life. Lewis continued, singing that what they were showing was certainly true, and even though life may last about 500 years, why was it so troubled? His performance moved the crowd, bringing tears to some people's eyes as they felt the sorrow in the song. Another man observed that the song was both sad and suffocating, but at the same time, the pain seemed to be lifting. Lewis looked at Lucia, signaling for her to begin playing the instrument, and she did so. Lewis continued singing, expressing that life was like everyone else's, and that although he would leave, he knew what they were saying was indeed true. As he finished, the audience stood, and even the person who had been calling for the contestants was silent. The crowd began clapping, cheering for an encore. Lewis waved his hand, acknowledging them, and thought to himself that this was the power of K-pop in this world. Lucia, however, didn't seem quite as fine at that moment. They returned home, and Lewis collapsed into his seat, mentioning how tired he was and how difficult singing had been. Moana patted his head, telling him he was incredible and wondering how he could sing so well. The twins chimed in, saying that Lewis was the best. Lewis chuckled, wondering if they couldn't take their eyes off him. Lucia was heading upstairs, apologizing as she was feeling tired and needed to rest. Moana seemed concerned about Lucia as well. While Lucia was lying in her room, Moana came to sit beside her, asking how the day had gone and if it had been great. Lucia replied that it was good. Moana smiled and said she was so glad. It had been so long since she had seen Lucia on stage, and it made her really happy. Lucia sat up and asked if they didn't hate her. Moana looked at her in confusion, wondering why she would think that. Lucia began to cry, explaining that it was because of their parents' death. Moana gently hit her, telling her not to say such things. She had told Lucia time and again that it wasn't her fault. Their parents had made their own choice to protect the person they loved most. Moana added that, just like them, she cared about Lucia more than anything in the world, and she didn't need to apologize or think she was to blame. With tears streaming down her face, Lucia hugged Moana tightly. Moana reassured her, saying she wasn't asking Lucia to sing right away. But if she kept stepping onto the stage, slowly and steadily, like she had done today, she would surely be able to sing again like before. Moana knew that sirens were at their most beautiful when they sang. Lucia cried even harder at these comforting words. Lewis, who had been watching all of this from outside the room, smirked and muttered to himself, as expected of me. He turned to leave, saying that the first phase of the operation had been a success. As Lewis moved to a different room, he found Finn lying there injured. He rushed to check on her, wondering what had happened and why she was so badly hurt. Finn managed to say something about a warehouse at the west end of the park and a man there. But before she could say more, she fainted, and Louis, now deeply worried, was left to tend to her. Pablo stood at the warehouse door, banging on it to enter. The two men inside wondered what was happening and who he was. Pablo muttered to himself, realizing that this was where all of Lufthagen's elixirs had disappeared to, and he had hidden them here. One of the men asked what he was talking about, insisting they weren't hiding anything. Pablo grabbed the man by his t-shirt, telling him he knew they were up to something, and that it would be better for him to confess, while Pablo was still being polite. The man continued to deny it, asking what Pablo meant. Just then, Damon arrived, telling Pablo to leave the man alone. He didn't know what Pablo was doing there, but suggested they could clear up any misunderstandings if they just talked. Ignoring Damon, Pablo threw the man into the fog and said that the ones who want to talk were usually the ones with something to hide. He then turned to Damon, demanding to know why he had hidden all those elixirs in the warehouse. Was he plotting something shady? Damon replied that he didn't understand what Pablo meant by plotting, but that the elixirs had been legally purchased and were meant to be exported to the Autumn continent. He wasn't sure where Pablo had gotten his information, but he insisted that Pablo was mistaken. Pablo raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Well, I will just check the warehouse myself, he said, his voice full of suspicion. Damon shrugged, telling him to go ahead if he wanted to. Pablo headed toward the door to descend into the basement, wondering about the place. It used to be where small fishing boats were built back when Lufthagen was just a fishing village. Damon explained that they sometimes use it to move goods. Louis, who had been watching from the side, remarked that it seemed like a good place to hide something like a magical beast. Pablo threw his giant hammer towards the clanway, expecting some reaction. But to his surprise, nothing happened and his hammer bounced away. He frowned, wondering why there was no reaction. Damon said it was because there was nothing there, just as he had told Pablo. Shocked, Pablo pushed forward, determined to check for himself. He insisted that he wouldn't give up so easily. Damon followed with a fire stick, warning that if Pablo pushed any further, things would not remain calm. Pablo reached the wall and stopped, staring at it in disbelief. Damon reiterated that there was nothing there, and if Pablo kept pushing, he wouldn't just sit back and watch. Frustrated, Pablo left the warehouse with his hammer, clearly disappointed. As he emerged, he saw Louis and Moana waiting outside. Louis asked what he was doing there, and Moana asked him to find Pablo. Pablo approached, explaining that he had already checked the underground waterways and found nothing. Louis suggested that maybe they had already moved it elsewhere, and told Pablo to step aside. Louis would take care of it from there. Pablo greeted Damon, mentioning that he remembered meeting him earlier. Damon asked who he was. Louis introduced himself, explaining that he was staying at the Siren's shelter with Pablo. A man nearby told Damon that this was the kid he had mentioned earlier, the one from the Kane's Night preliminaries. Damon turned to Louis and asked if he was the one who had gone on stage with Lucia, and he heard that Louis sang very well. Louis nodded in agreement. Damon remarked that it must have been difficult to persuade Lucia to perform on stage, but that was quite impressive. He then asked if Louis had also convinced Pablo to join him. Louis was curious, asking what Damon meant by that. Damon responded, accusing people without evidence can lead to terrible consequences, like what happened to Lucia's parents. Pablo, clearly angered, asked what he just said. Louis quickly intervened, explaining that Pablo could be a bit simple-minded and tended to act without thinking things through. He promised to talk to him later. Damon appreciated Louis' understanding. As Damon prepared to leave, Louis mentioned that there was something he was curious about. Damon asked what it was. Louis pointed to the horn flute Damon was carrying and asked what it was for. Damon, slightly taken aback, asked why Louis was curious about it. Louis replied that it seemed nice and he was thinking of getting one for himself. Damon told him that it wasn't something easy to find, it was quite rare and hard to acquire. At that moment, they entered the room and shut the door. Once inside, Pablo asked Louis what they should do now. Should they tell Tirius? Louis shook his head, replying if Tirius gets involved, a war could break out in the city and innocent people could die. Besides, they can't ruin Lucia's return to the stage over something like this. Pablo, puzzled, asked about her return. Louis explained, I had a plan to take more time bringing her back, but it looks like I will need to speed things up. This was going to be the most spectacular festival yet. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Damon grabbed the collar of the man, demanding to know what was going on. Firstly, the creature that had been quiet suddenly started acting up, and now Pablo's snooping around. What's going on with the warehouse management? The man, nervous, admitted he didn't know. Damon sighed and drew his sword. It's unfortunate, he said before stabbing the man. As the man fell, Damon remarked that it seems they will have to move the plan forward. The second boy hesitated, asking if it was time to move the plan, even though they hadn't fully tamed it yet. Damon replied firmly that there's no time to waste. Now that Pablo has caught wind of something, they need to act before we're exposed. They will release it at the same time as the Kane's Night Final tomorrow, and it's going to be a grand festival. Pablo told him that no matter how much he researched, there was no sign of the sea beast anywhere. So Lewis asked if Damon was still certain that Damon would make a move. Lewis agreed, saying that since Damon had been captured, he wouldn't be able to deny it any longer. If his goal was to take down Terrius, he would want to stir up chaos during the festival and then present himself as the one to resolve it. It would be the perfect opportunity to make a strong impression on the Lord. Pablo responded that in order to do so, Damon would need to control the sea beast. He asked if this meant Damon was a druid like Jacob. Lewis clarified that Damon was not a druid and that he hadn't sensed any mental magic from him, but he did have a very rare item. Lewis believed the Sea King's horn was a flute carved from the horn of a sea dragon, according to legend. It was said that whoever controlled it could command sea beasts at will. Lewis didn't know how Damon had obtained such a treasure, but with it, even without being a druid, he could easily control the sea beasts. Lewis mentioned that if they could steal the horn, they could drastically shorten their plans for heading to the Autumn continent. That was when Pablo understood the real goal. Lewis told him that Damon was going to act that night for sure, so they should keep an eye on the port. Pablo was confused and asked for clarification, questioning where Lewis was going. Lewis replied that he had something else to take care of first. He then saw Carrie sneaking through a window in a house. Lewis asked what Carrie was doing there. Carrie, startled by the sudden question, flustered and said he wanted to tell Lucia how happy he was to see her back on stage after such a long time. Lewis teased him, saying he should have some sense, but that it was nice that Carrie had such good intentions. Carrie, irritated, shot back at Lewis. Lewis then gave Carrie a task to fill the plaza with people for that night's event. Carrie wondered why they needed to fill the plaza and asked for the reason. Lewis told him not to ask any questions, just to do as he was told and not to complain about how hard it would be. Carrie replied that he could fill the entire plaza with just his family. Lewis appreciated that response and left, but not before adding that Carrie should bring a bouquet of flowers. Lewis said that Carrie would want to score some points at the right moment. Carrie wondered what the right moment was. The night of the festival arrived and the plaza was packed with people. Lucia, observing the crowd, remarked on how many people there were. She mentioned that even during the last Cain's night, it hadn't been so crowded. Lewis thought to himself that Carrie had really done it. He had filled the plaza. As the audience cheered with excitement, the host lady thanked everyone for attending. Lucia thought to herself that she had never imagined such a day would come again. And if it weren't for Lewis, she couldn't have even dreamed of it. The man on stage announced that the next participants were the ones everyone had been talking about, so he urged the audience to give a rousing welcome to Lewis and Lucia. Lucia, still overcome with fear, felt the pressure as many people in the crowd reached out to touch her hand, telling her she had done enough and to stop running from her painful memories. She wondered what they meant by that. Lewis, direct than the others, told her that what would her late parents say if they saw her avoiding singing just because of the guild? Was this really how she wanted to live? Lucia was taken aback and asked that how did he know that? Lewis didn't answer and simply stepped onto the stage with a bow. Lucia called out to him, and he paused, turning to her. He warned to think carefully, and what did she think her parents really wanted for her? She stood there, wondering what they would have wanted. Lewis stood alone on the stage with his bow. A man in the audience whispered, why was Lewis performing alone? The woman beside him seemed disappointed, noticing that Lucia wasn't there. Lewis began to play the bow and his music filling the air as he sang. In the cold winter, I slept under a warm blanket, walking through a snowy field that sparkled like jewels in my dreams. As I walked, snowflakes fell from the sky. As he continued, the man next to him realized that the song The Dream of a Child, which he used to sing it with my parents when he was a kid. The lady beside him recalled that Lewis had sung an unfamiliar song during the preliminaries, but it seemed that now he was singing something everyone recognized. His voice was mesmerizing, almost magical. Some in the crowd felt as if they had been enchanted. Lewis continued, his voice steady and filled with emotion. In the dark forest, I heard a scary sound. A monster with white fur was chasing me, and I was so scared, calling for my parents to help. As Lewis sang, Lucia's mind wandered back to her past, remembering her family. She thought about what her parents would have wanted for her as she listened to the haunting song. She then stepped onto the stage, continuing the lyrics. They looked down at their beautiful child, fast asleep under a warm blanket. The child whimpered, scared from a bad dream, but it was all right. The parents were there. Father would fight off the monster with his axe, and Mother would hold the child tight. Tears welled up in Lucia's eyes as she sang. Moana, watching from the audience, was deeply moved. The scene reminded her of the conversation she had had with Lewis earlier, when he had asked about the lullaby their parents used to sing when they were children. Moana had wondered why Lewis wanted to know, and he had simply replied, I want someone to hear it. Moana became emotional as she realized that what Lewis had asked her to do was exactly what she needed. She felt incredibly thankful to him for it. Lucia continued singing, her voice so soft and comforting. The parents were always by their side, until the warm sunlight melted the snow. Finally, Lewis brought the song to a close. Carrie, overwhelmed with emotion, was crying as he clapped enthusiastically, appreciating Lucia's performance. The audience, too, recognized the song as a siren's lullaby, and they all joined in with applause. Lucia smiled gratefully and thanked them all for their support. As she stepped down from the stage, Lewis nodded to her and quietly left the area, confident that the first part of their plan had been executed perfectly. Now, with the festive mood in full swing, it was time to make sure nothing would disrupt the celebration. It was time to finish the rest. Damon was living on a boat, and as he came ashore, Pablo met him, asking where he had been sneaking around like a rat. Was he hiding something valuable on the offshore rock islands, perhaps? Damon replied that people often say birds of a feather flock together, and Pablo was doing the same thing that Lucia's parents had done. Pablo asked what Damon was talking about and why he was bringing them up all of a sudden. Damon responded that they had grown too accustomed to tailing him persistently, just like Pablo, up until the tragic accident that claimed their lives. Pablo asked if Damon was suggesting that he was responsible. Damon wondered who knew the truth and admitted that he couldn't confirm it for Pablo. However, he added that he didn't let anyone who interfered with his work live in peace. Lewis rushed at him with a hammer, but Damon used his two small swords to block the attack, asking if Pablo really thought he would go after Terius without the power to back it up. Several people surrounded Pablo, but Damon told him not to worry about the two daughters of the Siren's shelter, as he would personally handle them. Pablo rushed to attack, and as others stepped in to stop him, he told them to get out of his way. Damon glanced at the ocean, wondering if the shelter had anything to do with the festival. Lewis was sitting nearby, commenting that it seemed Damon had the wrong idea. The festival was happening at the plaza, not here, and Damon had lost his way. Damon replied that kids shouldn't be out so late, or they would get into trouble. Lewis jumped up, thanking him for the concern, but mentioning that his household was pretty laid back, so it wasn't a problem. Besides, he wasn't planning on going easy on Damon, especially after making Lucia cry. Damon was going to pay for that. Damon told him to watch his mouth and that he didn't hold back for kids. Lewis smiled, saying that was perfect. He wasn't planning on holding back for adults either. Damon drew the sword and moved to attack, but Lewis countered with spatial magic. Seeing the magic, Damon asked if Lewis was a mage. Lewis replied that Damon talked too much and demanded that Damon make a move or he would attack first. Damon blocked the attack with his sword, but he was knocked back and slammed into a wall. Lewis was surprised that Damon was able to block the attack, wondering if he was actually better than Pablo. Meanwhile, Pablo was fighting others nearby and asked if Lewis was comparing him to Damon in this situation. Suddenly, a massive beast appeared, attacking Lewis. Lewis jumped back just in time, narrowly avoiding the creature's bite. The beast was enormous and now stood behind Damon. Damon told Lewis that he was quite skilled for his young age, but that was the extent of his little act. It was a bit earlier than Damon had planned, but he couldn't hold back and guessed that he would have to deal with Lewis first. He blew the instrument he had, and as he harnessed the power in his hands, the beast stood before him. Damon referred to the beast as worthless and commanded it to attack him. Lewis, however, studied the beast and thought it hadn't been fully tamed yet. If that were the case, he would take control. Using his mental magic, he dominated the beast and ordered it to capture and eat Damon. Damon was shocked. As the beast moved to attack him, Damon blew the instrument again, causing the beast to turn toward Lewis instead. Lewis jumped to dodge, realizing that his mental magic wasn't strong enough to overpower the effect of the Sea King's horn. He couldn't face the beast head-on, and they were in the middle of the city. Wondering what to do next, Lewis looked at the sea, which had several boats, and an idea struck him. He called the beast, challenging it to a proper fight. He then jumped into the sea, leaving Pablo worried. The beast followed Lewis into the water, and Damon called Lewis a fool, wondering if he intended to challenge a sea serpent in its own domain. Damon believed Lewis had just signed his own death sentence. As the beast opened its mouth, Lewis entered and transformed into a dragon. He pried open the beast's jaw, declaring that since it was underwater, he didn't need to hold back anymore. It was time to fully release his dragon transformation. With a powerful lift, he moved the beast's teeth aside and launched his attack. The beast, confused and unable to understand what was happening, struggled to comprehend the sudden change. Lewis pulled away, taunting the beast, saying it had been enjoying itself a moment ago, but had now met its match. Lewis then delivered a powerful punch, creating a massive shockwave that even made the beast scream in pain. As the beast attempted to flee, Lewis grabbed his body, asking where it thought it was going. Things were getting interesting now, and there was no way he would let it escape so easily. With that, he spun the beast beneath the water, trapping it.